Halo, Ghosts of Onyx, by Eric Nyland. Read for you by Jonathan Davis. Prologue. Beta Company's victory at Pegasi Delta. 11:35 hours, July 3rd, 2545. Military calendar. 51 Pegasi B system. Target area Apache. Planet Pegasi Delta. The orbital pod impacted, and metal wrenched and sparked. Inside his cocoon of titanium, lead foil, and stealth ablative coating, Spartan B-292 watched black stars explode across his vision. He tasted blood in his mouth, and the last air compressed from his lungs. Tom's training kicked in. He pulled the pod's twisted frame apart and blinked in the bright blue sunlight. Something was wrong. 85 Pegasi 914A was supposed to be a faint yellow sun. This was electric blue, boiling plasma blue. He jumped, rolling to one side as the blast washed over him. The outer layers of his semi-powered infiltration armor boiled and peeled like a bad sunburn. Training. His instructor, Lieutenant Commander Ambrose, had said, "Your training must become part of your instinct. Drill until it becomes part of your bones." Tom reacted without thought. A lifetime of training took over. He raised his MA-5K assault rifle and fired along the trajectory of the plasma bolt, making sure to sweep low. His eyes cleared, and as he automatically reloaded his weapon, he finally saw the surface of Pegasi Delta. It could have been hell. Red rocks, orange dust-filled sky, the scars of a dozen impact skids and craters around him, and 30 meters ahead, dark purple splashes of jackal blood soaking into the sand. Tom pulled out his sidearm and warily moved to the fallen aliens. There were 5 with extensive wounds to their lower legs. He shot them each once in their odd angular, vulture-like heads. Then he knelt, relieved them of their plasma grenades, and stripped off their forearm force shields. Although Tom wore a full suit of semi-powered infiltration armor, colloquially called SPI armor by Section 3 technophiles, its hardened plates and photoreactive panels could only take a few glancing shots before failing. The armor's camouflaging textures sputtered and stabilized, however, and once again blended into the rocky terrain. Every Spartan 3 had received extensive training in using the enemy's equipment, so Tom would improvise. He strapped one of the jackal shields to his forearm. It was excellent protection, as long as you remembered to crouch behind it and cover your legs, a tactic larger UNSC soldiers would have trouble accomplishing. The display on his faceplate flickered to life, a transparent layer of ghostly green topology. 100 kilometers overhead, the baseball-sized Stealth Tactical Aerial Reconnaissance Satellite, or STARS, had come online. A single blinking dot appeared that represented his position. Tom was 5 kilometers south of the primary target. He scanned the horizon and saw the Covenant factory city in the distance, looming from the rocky surface like a castle of rust, with giant smokestacks and blue plasma coils pulsing deep inside. Beyond the factory lay the lavender shoreline of a toxic sea. Additional dots appeared on his heads-up screen. A dozen, 2 dozen, and then hundreds. The rest of Beta Company was online. 291 of them. 9 hadn't made it. Either dead on re-entry, or killed from the impact, or by Covenant forces before they could get out of the pods.
Covenant ground forces own
After the mission, he'd checked the roster to see who they'd lost. For now, he stuffed his feelings into a dark corner of his mind. Tom sighed with relief as he saw the 8 X's, representing the sub-prowler Black Cat exfiltration craft, appear and then fade on his display. That was their only way off this rock after Operation Torpedo was accomplished. Text scrolled on his display. Team Foxtrot, proceed on Vector 086. Provide flanking support to Team India.
CP's this way.
No reply was necessary. Orders were broadcast from stars overhead, and any break of radio silence would reveal their position. 3 of the dots on the display winked, and tiny numbers faded into view. B-091 was Lucy. B-174 was Min. And B-004, that was Adam. His friends. Fire Team Foxtrot.
I'm calling it. It's 19.
Tom loped forward, found an outcropping of rock, and took cover under it, waiting for them to catch up.
He's pinned down up front.
To stay on task and not get distracted by his racing heartbeat, he reviewed Operation Torpedo one more time. Pegasi Delta was home to a covenant refinery. The sea on this tiny world was unusually rich with deuterium and tritium, which they used in their plasma reactors. The factory processed the stuff and refueled their ships, making this covenant operation on the edge of UNSC territory a prime target. It allowed the enemy easy access to human space. There had been previous operations to neutralize the target. UNSC CENTCOM had sent nukes launched from slipspace, but plutonium emitted an aura of Cherenkov radiation above re-entering normal space, making all the stealth coatings and lead linings useless. The Covenant had easily detected and destroyed them. There were similarly too many Covenant ships near the moon to send a slow, distantly launched nuke in normal space. Nor was a regular invasion, or even the elite Helljumper ODSTs, worth the attempt. The UNSC had one chance to take the factory out before the enemy would muster their defenses. So they were sent. The 300 Spartans of Beta Company had been launched 7 hours ago into slipspace from the UNSC carrier, all under heaven. They'd endured the ride in long-range stealth orbital drop pods, suffered debilitating nausea transitioning unshielded into normal space, and then got parboiled on the fiery ride to the surface of Pegasi Delta. From the warm welcome given by those 5 jackals, Tom knew they'd been detected. But the Covenant might not yet know the size of the breach in their security. He'd have to move quick, take advantage of whatever element of surprise remained, blow the factory, and if possible, the secondary targets of ammunition depots and methane reserves. They could still do this. They had to do it. Destroying that factory would triple the length of the Covenant supply lines to UNSC space. This is exactly what Tom had trained for since he was 6 years old. Years of drills and war games and schooling. But that might not be enough. He heard the crunch of gravel under a boot. He spun, rifle raised, and saw Lucy. Every Spartan 3 looked the same in their semi-powered infiltration armor. The angular shifting camo pattern of the spy armor was 1 part Legionnaire male, 1 part tactical body armor, and 1 part chameleon. Tom, however, recognized Lucy's short, careful gait. He made the 2 fingers over faceplate gesture, the age-old silent Spartan welcome. She gave him the slightest of nods. Tom handed her a Jackal shield unit and 2 plasma grenades. Adam arrived next, and Min 10 seconds after that. When all their appropriated shields were in place, Tom gave Team Foxtrot a series of quick, sharp hand gestures, ordering them to move ahead in a loose arc formation, stealthy but fast. As he stood, thunder rumbled, fire flashed in the sky, and a shadow covered them and vanished. 2 teardrop-shaped Covenant Seraph fighters roared over their hiding spot. A line of plasma erupted 100 meters behind them, an inferno that billowed and blossomed straight toward his team. Tom leapt to one side, activating his Jackal shield, holding it between him and the 3,000-degree flames that would melt through his spy armor like butter. The force field flared white from the radiation. His skin on his palms prickled with blisters. The plasma passed, thinned, evaporated. The air cooled. Covenant air support was already in play. That made the situation 100 times worse. With a blink, Tom switched his heads-up display from TACMAP to Team Bio. All members of Team Foxtrot showed skyrocketing pulses and blood pressures, but they were all still green, all alive. Good. He sprinted. Stealth was no longer an operational priority. Getting to the factory where they couldn't be strafed was all that mattered. Behind him, Lucy, Adam, and Min fell in line, covering the rough ground in long, powerful strides at nearly 30 kilometers an hour. Red ovals appeared on Tom's TACMAP. Covenant Seraphs on another attack run. More than before. 3, 6,
I'm calling it. It's
10.
1900. The lieutenant got
Tom
hit as soon
glanced
as
to
we
either
dropped
side
in.
and saw his comrades. Hundreds of
Sergeant Banks,
Spartans
man.
running
He's
across
pinned
the
down our
broken
front.
ground.
Come on, I'll show you.
The dust from their charge filled the air and mingled with the smoke from the last plasma blasts. 3 Spartans lagged behind, turned and braced, holding M19B SAM missile launchers. They fired. Missiles streaked into the atmosphere, leaving snaking trails of vapor. The first bounced off an incoming Seraph shield. The missile exploded, not damaging the craft, but buffeting it nonetheless into its wingmen. Both craft tumbled, lost 50 meters of altitude, and then recovered. But their leading edges scraped the ground, dissipating their weakened shields, and they spun end over end, erupting into fiery pinwheels. The 2 other missiles struck their targets, overloaded shields, leaving their target Seraphs covered in soot, but otherwise intact. Tom could see the Seraphs wave off their attack runs. A small victory. Tom slowed to a trot and watched as the remaining 6 Seraphs dipped and released their plasma charges, then pulled up, rolled, and vanished in the haze. Each charge of dropped plasma was a brilliant pinpoint that elongated into a lance of boiling sun-fueled sapphire. When they hit the ground, they exploded and fanned forward, propelled at 300 kilometers an hour by momentum and thermal expansion. A wall of flame appeared on Tom's left, and it made the camo panels of his spy armor shiver blue and white. But he didn't move. He remained transfixed on the other 5 fires enveloping scores of Spartans. The plasma slowed, still boiling, and then the clouds cooled and thinned to a dull gray haze, leaving crackling glassed earth and bits of charred bone in its wake. On his tac map, dozens of dots winked off. Lucy sprinted past Tom. The sight of her snapped him back to action, and he ran. There'd be time for fear later, and for revenge. When they blew this factory, there'd be plenty of time for bloody revenge. Tom shifted his focus off his tac map on his helmet's faceplate and farther ahead to the primary target, now only 500 meters distant. From the center of the city-sized factory, the blue glow was too intense to stare directly at, casting hard shadows in the web of pipes and the forest of smokestacks. The structure was a kilometer square, with towers rising 300 meters, perfect for snipers. Tom forced himself to run faster, ahead of Lucy, Adam, and Min, darting from side to side. They understood and mimicked his evasive tactic. Plasma bolts exploded near his foot. He weaved back and forth through a hailstorm of high-angle trajectories. His suspicions about snipers had been correct. He dodged, kept running, and squinted ahead at the edge of the factory. His faceplate automatically responded and zoomed to 5 times magnification. There was another threat. Shifting luminescent edges of force fields, jackal shields. And in the shadows, the arrogant eyes of a Covenant elite in purple armor, staring straight back at him. Tom skidded to a halt, grabbed the sniper rifle slung on his back, and sighted through the scope. He stilled his labored breathing. A plasma bolt sizzled near his shoulder, crackling the skin of his spy armor, singeing his flesh, but he ignored the pain, irritated only that the shot had thrown him momentarily off target. He waited for the split second between the beats of his heart, and then squeezed the trigger. The bullet's momentum spun the elite around. The articulation of its neck armor exploded off the creature. Tom shot once more, and caught it in the back. A splash of bright blue blood spattered the pipes. Jackals emerged from the shadows at the periphery of the factory, crawling out behind pipes and plasma tubes. There were hundreds of them, thousands, and they all opened fire. Tom rolled to the ground, flattening himself into a slight depression. Adam, Min, and Lucy dropped as well, their assault rifles out in front of them, ready to fire. Plasma bolts and crystal shards crisscrossed over Tom's head, too many to dodge. The enemy didn't have to be able to see them. All they had to do was fill every square centimeter of air with lethal projectiles. His team was pinned, easy picking for those Seraphs on their next pass. How had the Covenant mustered such a counter-response so quickly? If they'd been detected earlier, their drop pods would have been vaporized en route, Unless they'd had the extreme bad luck to get here when a capital ship had been docked at the factory. On the blind side? Could the stars overhead have missed something that large? One of Lieutenant Commander Ambrose's first lessons echoed in Tom's head. Don't rely on technology. Machines are easy to break. Tom's comm crackled. M-19 Sams, execute Bravo maneuver. Targets painted. All other teams ready to move. Tom understood. They needed cover, and the only cover was dead ahead in the factory. From the field, 6 smears of vapor lanced forward to the factory. The M-19 Sams detonated on contact with pipes and plasma conduits, exploding into clouds of black smoke and blue sparks. The enemy fire slowed. That was their opening. Tom rolled to his feet and sprinted for the thickest smoke. Team Foxtrot followed. Every other Spartan on the field charged as well. Hundreds of half-camouflaged, armored figures running and firing at the dazed jackals, appearing as a wave of ghost warriors. Half liquid, half shadow, part mirage, part nightmare. They screamed a battle cry, momentarily drowning the sound of gunfire and explosion. Tom yelled with them, for the fallen, for his friends, and for the blood of his enemies. The sound was deafening. Jackals broke ranks, turned to flee, and got shot in the back as their shields turned with them. But hundreds more held their ground, overlapping shields to form an invulnerable phalanx. Tom led Team Foxtrot into the smoke-filled shadows of the factory. He found the pipe, the size of a redwood, dripping condensed water and green coolant, and took cover behind it. In the mist, he saw Lucy, Adam, and Min take positions behind cover too. He gave them rapid-fire orders with hand signals. Move in and kill. He spun around, his MA-5K rifle leveled, and found himself face to face with a Covenant elite. Its jaw mandibles split in mimicry of an impossibly large human grin. The monster held an energy sword in one hand and a plasma pistol in the other. It shot and swung. Tom sidestepped the deadly arts of energy, set his foot between the elite's two wide stance, pushed and fired at the same time. The elite sprawled onto the ground, and Tom tracked his body, spraying rounds into the slit of its helmet. He didn't miss. Team Foxtrot closed on him, leaving 6 dead jackals behind. Their bodies snapped like rag dolls. Behind on the field came rapid thumps and flashes of heat. Plasma grenades. Jackals and elites rushed from their cover in the factory to meet the rest of Beta Company on the field, realizing perhaps it would be suicide to face Spartans in close quarters. Thousands of Covenant clashed with 200 Spartans in open combat. Tracer rounds, crystal shards, plasma bolts, and flaring shields made the scene a blur of chaos. The Spartan Threes moved with speed and reflexes no Covenant could follow. They dodged, snapped necks and limbs, and with captured energy swords, they cut through the enemy until the field ran with rivers of gore and blue blood. Tom hesitated, torn between moving deeper into the factory complex and executing the mission, and running back to help his comrades. You didn't leave your friends behind. The sky darkened, clouds overhead turning steel gray. Tom's comm crackled to life.
Now,
Omega-3, execute now! Now! That stopped them cold. Omega-3 was the panic code, an order to break and run no matter what the cost. Why? They were winning. Tom then saw the clouds move, only they weren't clouds. Everything was clear to him now. Why there were so many Covenant here, and why Seraph's single ships, craft designed for space combat, were bombing them.
Bet you can't stick it. 7 Covenant cruisers sank from the clouds. Over a kilometer long, their bulbous, oblong hulls cast shadows over the entire field. If these ships had been parked in formation, refueling over the complex, the stars might have mistaken such large structures as part of the factory. We have to help them, Lucy whispered over the team comm. No, Min said, making a short cut motion with his hand. The Omega order. We're not running, Adam broke in. No, Tom agreed. We're not. The order is in error. Despite the environmental controls in his spy armor, he felt chilled. Seraph fighters dropped from the cruisers, dozens of them, and gathered into swarms. Darkly luminescent shafts of light appeared from the belly of each cruiser, transport beams, and from them marched hundreds of elites onto the field. But we can't help them either, Tom whispered to his team. Half of Beta Company turned to face the new threat. Impossible odds, even for Spartans. But they would buy time for the rest of them to find cover. Finding cover was a futile tactic, though. 7 Covenant cruisers had enough firepower to neutralize even 200 Spartans. They could pin them down, send in ground reinforcements by the thousands, or if they wanted to, glass the entire moon from orbit. That left only one option. The core, Tom told them. It's still our mission, and our only effective weapon. There was a heartbeat pause, and then 3 green acknowledgement lights winked on his display. His friends knew what he was asking. Team Foxtrot moved as one, running into the factory at top speed, dodging pipes and supply pods. A squad of 6 elites was ahead, hunkered behind a tangle of ducts. Tom tossed a handful of concussive grenades to disorient them, but his team kept running. Any delay, even to engage an enemy who could take shots at their backs, might rob them of their one chance. The surviving elites recovered and fired. Adam fell. One hand clutched at the crystal shards that penetrated his armor and punctured his lower spine. "Go!" Adam cried, waving them off. "I'll hold them!" Tom didn't break stride. Adam knew what had to be done. Keep fighting until there was no fight left in him. The core was 100 meters ahead. It was impossible to miss. So bright, Tom's faceplate automatically polarized to maximum tint, and it was still hard to look at. The core was the size of a 10-story building, pulsing like a huge heart, fed by glowing conduits and steaming coolant pipes, and encrusted with crystalline electronics. It was a marvel of alien engineering, and complex, which hopefully also meant easy to break. "Main coolant ducts there and there," Tom shouted over Team Comm and pointed. "I'll jam the dump valve." He moved to the base of the core. Lucy's and Min's acknowledgement lights winked. Tom's helmet's display fuzzed with static, then popped and went black. The reactor plasma and its intensely fluctuating electromagnetic field was wreaking havoc with their electronics. He found the dump valve, a mechanism the size of a Pelican dropship, just below the main chamber. He unspooled the thermite carbon cord and ran it around the valve twice. He then primed and activated the charge. A line of lightning brilliance flared and sizzled through Covenant alloy, fusing the valve into a solid lump. Tom glanced at Lucy. She set an explosive charge on one of the 2 main coolant lines that fed the reactor, and then set the timer on the detonator. Min was setting his timer too, then vanished in a flash of smoke and thunder. The core flared brighter than the sun. Coolant fumes screamed from twisted pipe and alarms blared. "No!" Lucy screamed. She ran past Tom toward the billowing cloud of toxic coolant. He caught her wrist, jerking her to a stop. "He's gone," Tom said. "EM field must have triggered his charge." She wrestled out of Tom's grasp. "We have to get out of here," he told her. She hesitated, taking one step toward Min. The support structure groaned and started to melt and sag from the superheating core. She turned back to Tom, nodded, and they ran out of the chamber, deeper into the factory complex, through a jungle of struts and hissing ducts, and splashing through lakes of leaked boiling coolant. The charge Lucy had set went off and silenced the reactor's alarms. Even with their backs to the reactor, running at a full-out flat sprint, the glare from the core doubled as it reached near supercritical phase. It was too much to endure, even through a polarized faceplate, and Tom squinted his eyes nearly shut. They turned a corner slid down the railing of angled stairs and onto a catwalk that protruded over a ledge. 500 meters below, an ocean churned against rocky cliffs. They'd made it through the factory, out the backside, where massive tubes sucked in the ocean water for processing. Lucy looked back at the factory, and then to Tom. She offered her hand. He took it. They jumped. In free fall, Tom struggled, pumping his legs. Lucy released his hand and straightened her body. He did the same, and then pointed his feet down a split second before he hit the water. The impact stunned him. Then he tasted salt and choked on water that filled his helmet. He clawed for the surface. The lining of his spy armor swelled, taking on water, weighing him down. He broke the surface, paddling as hard as he could with his legs to stay afloat. He clawed at his helmet release and pulled it off. Next to him, Lucy had her helmet off as well, gasping. "Look!" He nodded to the cliff tops. From this angle, Tom saw the Covenant cruisers over the field. Lances of laser fire rained down from the ship's lateral weapon arrays and blasted his fellow Spartans. Firepower meant for capital ship combat. How could anyone survive that? A new sun appeared. The supercritical core flared, and light filled the world. The cruisers rippled, distorted, their alloy skins boiling away in the heat. They disintegrated. Bits blasted outward. The rocky prominence shattered into molten debris. "Down!" Tom cried. He and Lucy pushed themselves underwater, diving to escape the overpressure and incinerating blast. His waterlogged armor might now save his life. Overhead, water flash vaporized. Droplets of liquid rock and metal hissed past him. Heat smothered him, and a giant hand grasped and squeezed until all Tom saw was blackness. Tom lay on the ground panting. They'd nearly drowned after the blast, but managed to shed their armor and finally, exhausted, swam back to the shore and dragged themselves around the edge of the battlefield and into the hills. He and Lucy had made it to Extraction Point 6, where he'd seen one of the stealth exfiltration ships. No Covenant reinforcements came. They had all been killed when the reactor blew. Operation Torpedo was a success, but it had cost the lives of everyone else in the Beta Company contingent. All that remained of the factory, the Covenant cruisers, and ground forces of Beta Company, was a glass crater 4 kilometers in diameter. No bones, not even a camo panel from a suit of spy armor. Gone. Whispers in the wind. Lucy pulled herself up against the hull of the Black Cat sub-prowler craft, her body trembling. She started to stagger back down the hill. "Where are you going?" "Survivors," she whispered, and took one uncertain step forward. "Foxtrot, we have to look." No one had survived. They had checked all the comm frequencies, searched the shoreline, fields, and hills on their long, silent hike back. No one else was alive. Lucy was tiny. Like Tom, she was only 12 years old. But at 1.6 meters and 70 kilos, Lucy was one of the smallest Spartan 3s. Without her spy armor and weapons, and her pale form covered only in modest body sheathing, she looked even smaller. Tom stood and gently put his arm around her. She trembled violently. "You're going into shock." He found a first aid kit and injected her with the standard post-mission anti-shock medical cocktail. "Survivors," she whispered. "There are none," he said. "We have to get out of here. The Black Cat's capacitors will drain in 4 hours, and we won't be able to jump to slip space." She turned to him, eyes wide and brimming with tears. "How are you sure we're alive?" Tom was alive. He was certain. But as he cast one final glance at the crackling fields of Pegasi Delta, he knew part of him had died today with Beta Company. He helped Lucy into the Black Cat prowler and closed the hatch. The sub-prowler's engines thrummed to life, then dulled to a whisper. The craft lifted and angled up into the darkening skies. Lucy's words asking if they were alive would be her last. Post-traumatic vocal disarticulation, the experts would eventually declare. And although recertified for duty, she would remain silent, either unable or unwilling to speak the rest of her life. In the years to come, Tom would reflect on Lucy's last question every day. How are you sure we're alive? Something had died for every Spartan that day. Section 1. Lieutenant Ambrose. Chapter 1. 1647 hours, May 1st, 2531, military calendar. 111 Tory system, Camp New Hope, Planet Victoria. John, Spartan 117, despite being encased in a half-ton of angular Mjolnir armor, moved like a shadow through the twilight forest underbrush. The guard on the perimeter of Base New Hope drew on a cigarette, took a final puff, and tossed the butt. John lunged. A whisper rustled, and he wrapped his arm around the man's neck, wrenching it up with a pop. The guard's cigarette hit the ground. Nearby, crickets resumed their night song. John pinged his status to the rest of Blue Team. 4 green LED lights winked on his display, indicating the rest of the extended perimeter guards had been neutralized. The next objective was a delivery gate, the weakest part of the rebel base's defense system. The guardhouse had 2 men outside, 2 on the rooftop, and several inside. Past this, however, the base had impressive security, even by Spartan standards. Motion and seismic sensors, a triple layering of guards, trained dogs, and overhead Mako-class drones. John blinked his status light green, the signal to proceed with the next phase. The setting sun just touched the edge of the horizon when the guards on the roof of the bunker twitched and crumpled. It happened so fast, John wasn't sure which Linda had targeted first. A heartbeat later, the 2 on the ground were dead as well. John and Kurt ran for the gatehouse. Kelly sprinted ahead, covering the 300 meters from the forest in half the time, and leapt to the roof in a single bound. She opened the roof's vent and dropped flashbang grenades. Kurt posted outside the door and swept the aft side for any targets. John waited on the other side of the steel and bulletproof glass security door, one hand on its handle, 1 foot braced against the wall. Inside, 3 muffled thumps sounded. John pulled, wrenching the door and frame from the steel reinforcing in the wall. Kurt entered, his M7 submachine gun burping 3-round bursts. John was in a moment later and assessed the threats in the blink of an eye. There were 3 guards already down. Behind them, banks of security monitors showed 100 views of the base. 7 other men sat at a card table, shaking off the effects of the flashbangs. They stood with their sidearms halfway out of their holsters. John calmly shot each man once in the head. Nothing moved. Kelly dropped outside the door, rolled inside, her weapon leveled. Security system. John whispered to her and Kurt. Fred and Linda appeared a moment later, and together they pulled and wedged the heavy door back into its twisted frame. All good outside, Fred told them. Kelly sat before the bank of monitors and pulled out a touchpad, booting the ONI computer infiltration software package. Kurt tapped on the keyboard, nodding to the sticky note under one monitor. Passwords posted, he said, shaking his head. Okay, Kelly muttered. We can do it the easy way, too. Running monitor looping protocol now. I'll get a clean path to the target. Kurt, meanwhile, flipped through various camera angles and subsystems on the displays. No alarms raised, he reported. He paused and watched a group of guards unloading ammunition canisters off a warthog. One man fumbled and dropped a can. Along its side was stenciled, Muta AP 09334. John hadn't ordered a subsystem sweep, though he hadn't specifically forbidden it either. Kurt's actions could trigger a red flag at the base's command and control. John had mixed feelings about using Spartan 051, Kurt, as Sam's replacement on Blue Team. On the one hand, he was an extremely capable Spartan. Chief Mendez had routinely given him command of Green Team during training exercises, and Kurt had often won when facing John's Blue Team. But on the other hand, he was, for a Spartan, undisciplined. He took time to talk with every Spartan, and even the non-Spartan personnel that trained and supplied them. As a professional soldier in the middle of two wars, one fighting an entrenched rebellion, the other taking on a technologically superior xenophobic alien race, Kurt spent a considerable amount of time and energy making friends. Camera system and detectors looped, Kelly announced and made a tiny circle with her index finger. We have 15 minutes while dogs and drones are rotated and refueled, so just guards to deal with. Move, John told his team. Kurt hesitated, eyes still fixed on the monitors. What? John asked. A funny feeling, Kurt whispered. This worried John. Everyone had performed flawlessly, and there were no signs the enemy had reacted to their presence. But Kurt had a reputation for sniffing out ambushes. John had been on the receiving end of Kurt's intuition several times during training. John nodded at the monitor, still devoid of anything but normal activity. Explain? The guards unloading that warthog, Kurt said. They look like they're getting ready for something. Security systems and machines can be fooled, or easily rigged to fool, he stated. People, they're not so easy. I understand, John said. We'll stay sharp, but we have to stick to the schedule. Let's move. Kurt got up, casting a glance back at the monitor as they exited the gatehouse. The Spartans melted from shadow to shadow, skirting around a warehouse, under officers' barracks, and finally, at the center of the base, they approached the edge of a warehouse. The building was surrounded by 3 fences posted with warnings that the gravel yard beyond was mined. 8 guards patrolled the perimeter. Parked on the side was a modified warthog. It had been cut in half, and a new midsection had been welded in place that looked like it could carry 10 men into battle. It would suffice. John withdrew a tiny rod and pointed it at the building. The radiation counter flickered to 100 times normal background level for this planet. That confirmed that their primary target was inside. 3 Fenris nuclear warheads. Recent battles with the Covenant had depleted UNSC stockpiles of fissile materials in this sector to almost nothing. Insurgents had heard of this, which indicated they also had a considerable intelligence capability, and they had contacted the regional CENTCOM to boldly offer a trade. They said they had stolen warheads. They claimed to have people with Borin syndrome and wanted the expertise in medicines only UNSC doctors could provide. CENTCOM said they'd consider the matter. They had considered it and sent in Blue Team to get those warheads. And if presented with the opportunity, they were to target any rebel leaders. John signaled his team to move out, disperse around the bunker, and take up positions to snipe the guards. Green acknowledgement lights winked on. Kurt's was last, with a palpable hesitation. John gave Kurt a short hand wave and then pointed at the warthog, indicating that he get the vehicle ready to move. Kurt nodded. Kurt's feeling that something was wrong was contagious. John didn't like it. He pushed his uncertainties aside. Blue Team was in position. John unslung his sniper rifle and sighted. He gave the go signal and watched as one guard and then another silently fell over. Linda had been quick and efficient as usual. John gave the go-ahead to move in. Blue Team eased inside, sweeping the dark corners of the building. The place was empty, save steel racks cradling 3 conical warhead casings. John's radiation counter jumped, indicating that they did not hold conventional explosives. He pointed at Kelly and Fred, to the rack, then to the warthog outside. They nodded. Kurt's acknowledgement light winked red. No Spartan flashed a red light on a mission unless they had a good reason. Abort, John said. Back out. Now. Dizziness washed over him. John saw Linda, Fred, and Kelly sink to their knees. Then blackness swallowed him. John awoke with a start. Every muscle burned. and it felt like someone had hammered his head. This was a good sign. It meant he wasn't dead. He tensed his muscles against an unyielding pressure. He blinked to clear his hazy vision and saw he sat propped against a wall, still in the high-security bunker. The warheads were also still there. Then John saw a dozen commandos in the warehouse watching him. They hefted the .30 caliber machine gun, favored by rebel forces. Nicknamed confetti makers, they were grossly inaccurate, but at point-blank range, it would hardly be a concern. The rest of Blue Team lay face first on the concrete floor. Technicians in lab coats crouched over them, capturing high-resolution digital video. John jerked against his inert armor. He had to get to his team. Were they dead? No need to struggle, a voice said. A man with long gray hair stepped in front of John's faceplate. Or struggle if you want. We've installed neural inhibitor collars on you and your comrades. UNSC's standard issue for dangerous felons. He smiled. I'd wager without one, you could and would rip me in half in that miraculous power armor. John kept his mouth shut. Relax, the man said. I'm General Graves. John recognized the name. Howard Graves was one of the 3 men believed to be in charge of the United Rebel Front. It was no coincidence he was here. You're suffering from rapid decompression. The bends, he told John. We used an anti-grav plate. Old technology that never panned out, but for our purposes it worked just fine. A focused beam fooled your armor sensors into thinking you were in a 10G environment. It increased internal pressure to save your lives, momentarily rendering you unconscious. You engineered this all for us, John said, his voice hoarse. You Spartans have put quite a dent in our efforts to liberate the frontier worlds, General Graves said. Station Jefferson, in the Eridanus asteroid belt last year. Our destroyer Origami. 6 months ago, our high-explosive manufacturing facility, followed by the incident in Micronesia, and our saboteur cell on Reach. I didn't believe it until I saw the video. All by the same 4-man team. Some said Blue Team was a myth. He rapped his knuckle on John's faceplate. You seem real enough to me. John struggled, but he might as well have been encased in a mountain of steel. The neural collar neutralized every signal traveling down his spine, save the autonomics to his heart and diaphragm. He had to focus. Did everyone on his team have a collar? Yes. Each Spartan had a thick clamp on the back of their neck, directly over the AI interface port. Graves had excellent intelligence on their equipment. Wait. John scrutinized his paralyzed team. Kelly, Linda, and Fred. No Kurt. Graves had said 4-man team. He didn't know about Kurt. As you surmised, Graves continued. This was all for your benefit. We scraped our official material together and made sure it was done so sloppily that even your Office of Naval Intelligence saw it happen. We anticipated the miraculous Blue Team would be sent. I am not disappointed that your leaders' minds are still so easily read. A young commando approached, saluted, and nervously whispered, Sir, external sensors are offline. Graves frowned. Drag the prisoners out of here. Sound the general alarm. Police those warheads and tell the lift ships to. A buzzing sound filled the air. John spied a blur of spinning metal through the doorway. He had a fraction of a second to see. It was an 8-armed Asteroidia anti-personnel mine. Its pressure trigger jammed with a chunk of gravel. Just before it detonated into a ball of thunder, metal pinged off John's armor. Everyone standing in the room doubled over from the concussive force and hail of shrapnel. 6 commandos with multiple cuts and bleeding ears rose, weapons ready, shaking their heads to clear the disorientation. The modified Warthog that had been parked next to the bunker crashed into the open double doorway. The entire warehouse shook. The commandos opened fire and rushed the doorway. The warthog pulled away. Then with a squeal, it reversed and then rammed the doorway again. The corrugated steel walls screeched, buckled, and with a shower of sparks, the vehicle wedged its midsection in the building like a pregnant queen termite. The commandos unloaded their confetti makers, puckering the hog's armor. The top of the midsection slid open, and 3 more asteroidia anti-personnel mines arced, whirling like a child's toy, each landing in a corner of the bunker, and exploded. White-hot metal fragments cut through the commandos like a scythe. Kurt leapt out and shot the 3 men still moving. He quickly went to each Spartan and pulled off the collars. Kelly rolled to her feet. Fred and Linda got up. Kurt yanked the collar off John's neck. His entire body tingled, but his muscles once again responded to his commands. He flexed his limbs. There was no permanent nerve damage. "We can forget about stealth now," John said. "Kurt, drive the warthog. Kelly, Linda, Fred, get those warheads loaded ASAP." They nodded. John went to General Graves. A sliver of corrugated steel had lodged in the man's skull. Unfortunate. Graves had held secrets of the rebels' command and intelligence structure. Secrets John had had the barest glimpse of. Their capacities had been greatly underestimated. With the larger Covenant threat looming, John wondered what the rebels would ultimately do. Attack a weakened UNSC as it battled aliens, or fight against humanity's common enemy? He ignored the larger strategic picture and focused on the tactical, helping Kelly maneuver the last warhead into the warthog's armored midsection. Loaded with the bombs and 5 armored Spartans, the vehicle bottomed its shocks. John climbed into the rear and Kurt drove, and they sluggishly accelerated away from the secure warehouse. "Best speed to the PZ," John ordered. Kurt turned on the warthog's radio. It buzzed with confused chatter. "Unit 1 non-responsive. Gunfire reported. Man down. Tracking APC. Open fire. Confirm. Confirm. All units converge. Do it now!" "Everyone," John shouted. "Into the center." Holes peppered the warthog. Armor-piercing rounds penetrating the side like paper and denting the casings of the warheads. "Behind the warheads!" Fred told them. John, Kelly, Fred, and Linda huddled behind the missiles. Nuclear warheads, ironically, would provide their best defense. Their casings were super-hardened, both to contain radiation and hold the fury of a small sun for a split second longer and to boost the thermonuclear yield. John looked up at the driver's seat. Kurt squeezed himself lower into the seat, presenting the smallest possible target, risking his life to get them all to safety. The warthog billowed smoke, but its speed slowly increased to 40 kilometers an hour. A sharp rattle came from the engine. A tire shredded, and the vehicle swerved right and then left. Kurt regained control and kept going. The AP fire slowed and then stopped. "Brace!" Kurt said and downshifted. The warthog barreled through the chain link and concertina wire barrier, over gravel fields and into the forest. "Road 32B to the PZ," Kurt said. Road was a creative overstatement. They bounced along, mowing down trees, fishtailing, and spraying mud. "Drones!" Kurt told them. "Get the hatch open!" John ordered. Kelly and Fred pulled the midsection roof panels apart. John stuck his head out and spotted 3 Mako-class attack drones jetting toward them, each heavy with a fat missile. One direct hit would take out the warthog. Even a near miss could destroy an axle. Linda popped up, her sniper rifle already in hand and eyes on the scope. John and Linda opened fire. The lead drone smoked and dropped into the trees. The next drone angled up, bobbing. It released its missile and banked away. A line of smoke appeared, a tail of fire, and a missile accelerated toward them at a frightening rate. Linda fired, squeezing off the rounds as fast as the chamber could cycle. The missile started to spin, but it was still dead on course. "PZ 300 meters, Kelly said, consulting her tablet. Welcome committee has us in their sights. Tell them we have the package, John said, and we need a hand. Roger that, she said. The missile was 2 kilometers from them, closing fast. Ahead, the forest turned into swamp. With a hurricane roar, a UNSC Pelican dropship rose over the treetops, and its twin chain guns spat a cloud of depleted uranium slugs at the incoming missile, making it bloom into a flower of fire and smoke. Stand by for pickup, Blue Team, the dropship's pilot said over their comm. We got incoming single-craft hostiles, so hang tight and go vacuum protocols. Check suit integrity, John ordered. He remembered Sam and how his friend had sacrificed himself, remaining on a Covenant ship under siege because of a breach in his suit. If a single AP round had breached their Mjolnir, they'd be in a similar jam. The Warthog, billowing thick black clouds, rattled to a stop. The Pelican settled over it and clamped tight. Blue Team came back all green status lights, and John relaxed. He'd been holding his breath. The Pelican lifted the Warthog, laden with Spartans and warheads, into the air. Make secure, the pilot said. Bogies inbound on vector 072. Acceleration tugged at John, but he stood fast, one hand bracing the nukes, the other against the punctured side of the Warthog. The clear blue light outside darkened to black and filled with the twinkle of stars. Rendezvous with the Bunker Hill in 15 seconds, the Pelican pilot announced. Prepare for immediate out-system slipspace jump. Kurt carefully eased out of the driver's seat and into the midsection to join them. Nice work, Fred told him. How did you know it was a trap? It was the guards loading ammunition off the Warthog, Kurt explained. I saw it at the time, but it didn't register until it was almost too late. Those ammo canisters were marked as armor-piercing rounds. All of them. You wouldn't need that much AP unless you were taking on a few light tanks. Or a squad of Spartans, Linda said, catching on. Us, Fred remarked. Kurt doggedly shook his head. I should have figured it out sooner. I almost got everyone killed. You mean you saved everyone? Kelly said, and she butted her shoulder into his. If you ever have another funny feeling, John told him, tell me and make me understand. Kurt nodded. John wondered about this man's feelings, his instinctive subconscious awareness of the danger. Scipio Mendes had made them all train so hard. Lessons in fire team integration, target prioritization, hand-to-hand combat, and battlefield tactics were part of their hardwired instincts now. But that didn't mean the underlying biological impulses were worthless. Quite the opposite. John set a hand on Kurt's shoulder, searching for the right words. Kelly, as usual, articulated the sentiments that John never could. She said, welcome to Blue, Spartan. We're going to make a great team. Chapter 2. 0500 hours, October 24th, 2531, military calendar. Aboard UNSC Point of No Return, interstellar space, Sector B-042. Colonel Ackerson ran both hands through his thinning hair and poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. His hand shook. Ironic that his career in the military had come to this. A secret meeting on a ship that technically didn't exist, about to discuss a project that, if successful, would never surface from the shadows. Eyes-only classification. Code words, double deals and backstabbing. He longed for earlier days, when he held a rifle in his hands. The enemy was easily recognized and dispatched, and Earth was the most powerful, secure center of the universe. Those times only existed in memory now, and Ackerson had to live in the dark to save what little light remained. He pushed back from the ebony conference table, and his gaze swept over the room, a 5-meter diameter bubble, bisected by a metal grate floor, with stainless steel walls brushed to a white reflective sheen. Once sealed, it became a Faraday cage, and no electronic signals could escape. He hated this place. The white walls and the black table made him feel like he sat inside a giant eye, always under observation. The cage, as it was referred to, was contained within a cocoon of ablative insulating layers and counter-electronics to provide further security. And this ensconced on the most secret ship in the UNSC fleet, Point of No Return. Constructed in parts and then assembled in deep space, Point of No Return was the largest Prowler-class vessel ever built. The size of a destroyer, she was completely radar invisible. And when her baffled engines ran below 30%, she was as dark as interstellar space. Point of No Return was the wartime field command and control platform for the UNSC Office of Naval Intelligence, NAVE Spec Wep, Section 3. Very few had actually seen this ship. Only a handful had ever been aboard, and fewer than 20 officers in the galaxy had access to the cage. The white wall sheathed apart, and 3 people walked in, boots clipping across the metal grate. Rear Admiral Rich entered first. He was only 40, but already gray. He commanded covert operations in Section 3, in charge of every field operation, save Dr. Halsey's Spartan 2 program. He sat on Ackerson's right, glanced at the water and scowled. He withdrew a gold flask and unstoppered it. The odor of cheap whiskey immediately assailed Ackerson. Next was Captain Gibson. The man moved like a panther, with the low, lopping strides indicative of time recently spent in microgravity. He was the field officer in charge of Section 3 Black Ops, the hands-on wet work counterpart to Rear Admiral Rich. And last, Vice Admiral Parangoski entered. The doors immediately sheathed close behind her. There were 3 distinct clicks as locks meshed into place, and then the room fell into an unnatural silence. Parangoski remained standing and assessed the others. Her iron gaze finally pinned Ackerson. "You better have one hell of a reason for dragging us all here through back channels, Colonel." Parangoski looked fragile, and closer to 170 years old than her actual 70 years. But she was, in Ackerson's opinion, the most dangerous person in the UNSC. She was the real power in Ani. To his knowledge, only one person had ever successfully crossed her and lived. Colonel Ackerson set 4 reader tablets on the table. Biometric scanners flashed on the sidebars. "Please, Admiral," he said. "If you would." "Very well." She growled and sat. "I'll bite." "Nothing new with that, Margaret," Admiral Rich muttered. She shot him a piercing glare, but said nothing. The 3 officers scanned the document. Captain Gibson sighed explosively and pushed the tablet away. "Spartans," he said. "Yes, we're all familiar with their operational record. Very impressive." From the scowl on his face, it was clear impressed was not what he was feeling. "And," Rich commented, "we already know your feelings about this program, Colonel. I hope you didn't bring us here to try and once again shut the Spartans down." "No," Ackerson replied. "Please scroll to page 23, and my purpose will become clear." They reluctantly examined his report. Captain Rich's brows shot up. "I've never seen these figures before. Mjolnir suit construction, maintenance staff, and recent upgrades to their microfusion plants. Christ, you could build a new battle group for what Halsey is spending." Vice Admiral Parangoski did not glance at the figures. "I've seen this before, Colonel. The Spartans are the single most expensive project in our section. They are, however, also the most effective. Come to the point." "The point is this," Ackerson said. Sweat trickled down his back, but he kept his voice even. If he didn't sell this, Parangoski might roll over him, and he'd find himself busted to sergeant and patrolling some dusty frontier world. Or worse. "I'm not suggesting that we shut the Spartans down," he continued, and gestured broadly with both hands. "On the contrary, we're fighting a war on 2 fronts. Rebels eroding our economic base in the outer colonies, and the Covenant, who as far as we know are committed to the total annihilation of humanity. Ackerson straightened and met Gibson's, Rich's, and then Parangoski's gazes. I'm suggesting we need more Spartans. A small flicker of a smile played over Vice Admiral Parangoski's thin lips. Crap, Rich muttered. He took a draw from his whiskey flask. Now I've heard everything. What's your angle, Colonel? Gibson demanded. You've been on record against Dr. Halsey's Spartan 2 since she started the program. I have, Ackerson said. And I still am. He nodded to the readers. Screen 42, please. They tabbed ahead. Here I detail the flaws of Halsey's undeniably successful program, Ackerson said. High cost. An absurdly small gene candidate pool. Inefficient training methodologies. Far too few final units produced. Not to mention her dubious ethics of using flash cloning procedures. Parangoski scrolled ahead. And you are proposing, a Spartan 3 program. Her cast iron expression didn't betray a hint of emotion. Consider the Spartan 2 as a proof of concept prototype, Ackerson explained. Now it's time to shift into production mode. Make the units better with new technology. Make more of them, and make them cheaper. Interesting, she whispered. He sensed he was getting through to her, so he pressed on. The Spartan 2s have one additional feature that makes them undesirable for our purposes, Ackerson said. A public presence. Although classified top secret, stories have leaked throughout the fleet. Just a myth at this point. But Section 2 has plans to disseminate more information and soon go public with the program. What? Rich pushed back from the table. They can't release details of a top secret. To boost morale, Ackerson explained. They'll build the legend of the Spartan. If the war goes as projected with the Covenant, we will certainly need drastic measures to maintain confidence among the rank and file. That means these Spartans will have to be what, protected? Rich asked, incredulous. If they're all dead, that makes the PSYOPs campaign kind of moot, don't it? Not necessarily, sir, Gibson remarked. They can be dead, just not a secret. I assume, Colonel, Parangoski said, that this public presence issue will not be a flaw with your proposed Series 3 program? Correct, ma'am. Ackerson set his hands on the table and bowed his head. He then looked up. This was a most difficult conclusion to come to. This new fighting force must be inexpensive, highly efficient, and trained to take on missions that traditionally would never be considered, not even by Halsey's supermen. Rich scowled at this and his forehead wrinkled. Suicide missions. High-value targets, Ackerson countered. Covenant targets. The battles we've won against this enemy have come at unacceptable losses. With their numbers, their superior technology, we have few options against such a force, save extreme tactics. He's right, Gibson said. Spartans have proven their effectiveness on high-risk missions, and although I hate to admit it, they're better than any human team I could assemble. Remove existing UNSC mandates for safety and exfiltration, and we have a shot at slowing the Covenant down. It will give us time to think, plan, and come up with a better way to fight. Parangoski whispered, You want to trade lives for time. Ackerson paused, carefully weighing his response, then said, Yes, ma'am. Isn't that the job of a soldier? Parangoski stared at him. Ackerson held her gaze. Rich and Gibson held their collective breath, speechless. Is there another option? Ackerson asked. How many worlds are now cinders? How many billions of colonists have died? If we save a single planet, gain a few weeks, isn't that worth a handful of men and women? Of course it is, she whispered. God help us all. Yes, Colonel, yes. It is worth it. Rich emptied his flask. I'll reroute funding for this thing through the usual places. No computer records. Too many damned AIs these days. Gibson said, I'll make sure you get equipment, DIs, and whatever else you need, Colonel. And I know of a perfect staging area to get this off the ground, Parangosky said. She nodded to Rich. Onyx, he said, half question, half statement. Do you know of a better place? She asked. Section 1 has made that place a virtual black hole. Rich sighed and said, Okay, I'll send you the file on the place, Colonel. You're going to love it there. Rich's assurances did not at all comfort, but Ackerson kept his mouth shut. He had everything he wanted. Almost. Just one more thing, Ackerson said. I'll need a Spartan, too, to help me train these new recruits. Captain Gibson snorted. And you're going to ask Dr. Halsey to lend you one? I have a different methodology in mind, he replied. Parangosky said, You need a Spartan to train Spartans, of course, but... Her voice lowered. Tread damned lightly. This thing goes public. People find out we're making disposable heroes, and morale will plummet across the fleet. Make sure no one in Section 3 knows about your Spartan 2 trainer or the Spartan 3s. They're going to have to vanish. Understood? Yes, ma'am. And for God's sake, she said, narrowing her eyes to slits, Catherine Halsey must never know. Her bleeding heart sympathies for the Spartans have won her too many admirers at CENTCOM. If that woman wasn't so vital to the war, we would have had her retired decades ago. Ackerson nodded. The three naval officers thumbed their tablet readers and the files erased. They rose and, without another word, left the cage. They had never been here. None of this had ever been discussed. Alone now, Ackerson reviewed his files and made plans. The first matter of business was already in the works. On screen appeared the career record of Spartan 051. Chapter 3. 0940 hours, November 7th, 2531. Military calendar. Groom Bridge 34 system, near construction platform 966A, decommissioned. Spartan 051, Kurt, jumped into utter emptiness. It was a 100-kilometer drop to the moon under his feet. He mentally made the adjustment to the free-floating world of space and noted that technically there was no under or above in space, just vectors, masses, and velocities. He switched on his reverse-angle camera and saw Kelly and Fred jump from the lock of the Prowler after him. He knew not to turn his head to look. The motion would make him gyrate out of control. Besides, in the vacuum-enhanced variant of Mjolnir armor, his mobility was a fraction of normal. A green status light winked on, confirming they were all on the same vector. They'd coast for several kilometers before they activated long-range thruster packs. Although slow, there were two good reasons to be cautious. First, when their Prowler circumference had re-entered normal space, the nav officer had picked up an echo, a partial ship silhouette, Prowler class. He had dismissed this as an echo from their re-entry to normal space that had bounced off the moon. The nav officer had assured them there was nothing to worry about. Still, the anomaly bugged Kurt. In case there was another ship, Kurt wanted to be well away before igniting packs. No need to needlessly give away the stealth ship's position. Second, they had detected an inert comm satellite on the dark side of the moon. Something you'd expect if the system was being monitored for a sneak attack. No signal had emitted from the thing. The circumference had jammed and then fried it with a burst from a pulse laser. Kurt just made the assumption this simple recon mission would be hot. That way, he'd be happy to be disappointed. He activated the single-beam laser team comm system and said, ETA to day-night demarcation in 5 minutes. System check thrusters. Kurt ran his own diagnostic. They couldn't take any chances with the packs.
Designed for long-range, deep space operations, it was one of the riskiest pieces of equipment they'd been trained on. Even with triple redundancy in nav system and stabilizers, one accident, and there was enough compressed triaminohydrazine in the double fuel tanks to propel you so far and so fast off course, rescue would be an astronomically remote possibility. Or as Chief Mendes had put it, start tumbling in this gear, start praying. Green status lights winked back at Kurt. ETA 3 minutes, he said. Roger, Kelly replied, and then she added, something wrong? No, Kurt said. Fred's voice came over the comm. When you say no like that, you mean yes. Just a feeling, he admitted. Silence hissed over their linked single-beam comms. Kurt watched in his rear angle display as Kelly and Fred activated their MA-5B assault rifles. A data cable linked each rifle to their T-Pack microprocessor to give the proper counter-thrust when the weapon fired. Kurt sighed, momentarily fogging his faceplate. Now they were jumpy too. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Too many things weren't adding up. There was the Echo and the inactive spy satellite. And why had CENTCOM picked them to go on a low-risk recon mission? This was just a simple look to check out reported suspicious activity at a decommissioned USNC shipyard. Sure, a long spacewalk was a high-risk maneuver, but not something you'd send 3 Spartans on. Coming up on the Twilight Zone, Kurt said. Go to radio silent. They drifted toward the razor line that marked night to day on the smooth, icy moon. There was no atmosphere, so the transition into the light would be quick. No sparkling sunrise, just a blinding flash of glare. They crossed into the light. Kurt's faceplate automatically polarized, and they got their first glimpse of the shipyard. Station Delphi was a floating city of welded scaffolding, cranes, docking pods, tubes, and grappling claws. There were no lights, no thermal emissions. Kurt snapped on his high-def recorder to capture every square meter of the derelict. Whoever had been responsible for the station's decommissioning 3 years ago had done a sloppy job. There was a halo of debris. Spinning steel girders, bolts, and battle plate flashing as it caught and reflected the dull red sunlight from the distant binary stars. It looked deserted, so Kurt winked his green status light 3 times, the all clear, to resume single-beam communication. Fred sent an image over Teamcom, the skeletal frame of a partially constructed ship, about 3 times the size of their prowler. He said, that TR steel alloy exposed to solar radiation is supposed to turn white. It's silver, Kurt replied. New construction? Check this out, Kelly said. She uploaded a series of images, capturing at increasing magnification a hull support cradle whose shape suggested the oddly angular structure of a stealth ship. Only this vessel had to be as large as a UNSC destroyer, which was impossible. A large stealth ship was an oxymoron. The bigger the ship, the more radiation leaked. The more thermals, the more stealth-coated surfaces had to be kept in perfect repair so they didn't reflect radar. Send that image on a single beam back to the circumference, Kurt ordered. Kelly's status light went green. Kurt swept his left hand forward, gathering data on his sensors-encrusted glove. Still no thermals. No, wait. As Station Delphi rotated slowly, a tiny white flare appeared. Hotspot, he said, and tagged the region on his display, sending coordinates to Fred and Kelly. Kurt's hand twitched. Years of communicating by silent, efficient hand signals were something you just didn't unlearn. Talk, even using a single beam, didn't feel right on this mission. One simple wave, however, could send him spinning. And while his T-Pack could compensate, Kurt wanted to continue to stealth without thrusters. Kelly moved her optics package on the spot, zoomed in, and they all saw a splash of rainbow colors. Kurt's radiation counter clicked wildly and then went dead. Broad spectrum pulse, he reported. I've seen one of those before, Fred told them.
They had to repair the Shaw Fujikawa translite engine on the Magellan. It was a risky op. Those things aren't meant to be taken apart once they go active. Shaw Fujikawa engines allowed UNSC ships to leave normal space and plow through a dimensional subdomain colloquially known as slipstream space. Kurt had received rudimentary training in how it worked. The drive used particle accelerators to rip apart normal space-time by generating micro black holes. Those holes evaporated via Hawking radiation in a nanosecond. The real quantum mechanical magic of the drive was how it manipulated those holes in space-time, squeezing a 100,000-ton cruiser into slip space. The mathematics of how this worked and how a ship re-entered normal space was well beyond him. It was actually beyond most human geniuses. Kurt, however, did know this about Shaw Fujikawa drives. They were dangerous. There was radiation and anecdotal evidence that the normal laws of nature bent in close proximity to an active unit. Update your mission logs and beam them back to the circumference, Kurt said. We're going to take a closer look at that thing and confirm it's what Fred thinks it is before we call in hazmat. There was a slight delay before Kelly's and Fred's acknowledgement lights blinked green. Kurt activated his T-Pack, puffed the thrusters, and angled toward Station Delphi. He tapped the attitude controls, adjusting pitch, roll, and yaw to avoid colliding with the bolts, beams, and tools spinning in the debris field. As they closed to within 100 meters of the sputtering, partially disassembled drive coils, his rear angle camera fuzzed with static. Getting interference here, Kurt said. You two hold position. I'll scout it out. Roger, Kelly said. There was an edge of concern in her voice. Grapple lines ready. Kurt crept closer and got a glimpse into the heart of the drive. A near ultraviolet glow that didn't match the thermal output. It wasn't possible for a hole into slipspace to exist for more than a fraction of an instant. But he couldn't help feeling that's exactly what this was. And the closer he drifted, the more likely he'd get pulled in and forever lost. But that was just a feeling. He hesitated. Kurt altered his direct trajectory and drifted toward a beam 30 meters over the Shaw Fujikawa engine. The space near the drive rippled like heat waves rising, impossible in a hard vacuum. His heads-up display flickered. Kelly spoke over the comm, her transmission filled with noise. Your IFF tag is breaking up. It shows your position in multiple regions. Abort the recon. If your electronics malfunction... The comm broke into a hiss of static. I've seen enough, Kurt said. Static answered him. I'm heading back. He tapped his altitude thrusters to spin around. The switch worked, but there was no action from the T-Pack nozzles. Kurt released the controls. Triple redundancy in the processors or not, if his T-Pack was affected by the nearby radiation, the last thing he wanted to do was give it a command to fire. He grasped the steel beam, and bracing, he waved back to his team. He couldn't see them out there, but he knew they were watching him. He knew they wouldn't let him down. With Kelly and Fred at his back, he could have been at the edge of hell, and they would have gotten him out. Of course, with a malfunctioning, partially deconstructed Shaw Fujikawa drive within spitting distance, that might be exactly where he stood. He spotted motion in the dark, a snaking orange and white striped rope and gyrating blob on one end. Kelly's rescue line. Perfect. No worries now. The steel beam sparked. Kurt reflexively let go, and arcs played across the alloy. Radiation inducing a charge. Every display in his helmet exploded into static. Rows of status lights blinked amber, then all red. Life support, hydraulics, power all fluctuated and failed. He had to get out of here before that Shaw Fujikawa translite drive completely shut down his suit. The basic laws of physics still worked here. Action and reaction, energy transfer and momentum. He pushed off the beam, back to Fred and Kelly, hoping to grab the rescue line on his way. If he missed, they would still find him. The only thing he cared about right now was getting away from the source of his suit's malfunction. He drifted. With his suit shut down, all he could do now was coast and wait. Lightning struck. He was ground zero, and thunder kicked Kurt forward like a rag doll. He'd absorbed a near-direct grenade explosion once, and it had felt something like this. Only this particular explosion hadn't been near him. It had been on his armor. His first thought was sniper fire, an ambush. But then his vision cleared and he saw stars, the dull red binary suns, and Station Delphi whirling around. His T-pack had busted a line. He could feel the propellant gushing out, even though the tanks had been designed with redundant shutoff valves and emergency self-sealing foam to prevent such a decompression. He heard CPO Mendes' voice in his head again. Start tumbling in this gear. Start praying. Mayday! He called out. Suit malfunction! Mayday! Kurt had no idea where he was, where his team was now positioned, or how fast he was rocketing away from them. Of course they didn't open radio channels on this mission. Point-to-point single-beam lasers carried their comm signal. Gyrating out of control, any signal that hit a tiny Spartan-sized target in the vast volume of open space would be nothing short of a miracle. He finally got enough bearings to tap the system override. No response. He hit the harness emergency release. It was jammed. I'm okay, he said over the comm. Life support's minimal but still functional. Going to deep breathing mode to conserve air and power. I'll ride it out. You should be able to pick up my IFF transponder once I'm clear. Activating rescue beacon now. I'll be okay. I'll be o. Chapter 4. Addendum. After action report. UNSC NAVSPEC Web Ops. File EHY 97. Subject. Spartan 051. During aforementioned operation, see attached mission profile to investigate possible rebel activity on the decommissioned construction platform 966A, unofficially named Station Delphi. A catastrophic malfunction of a thruster pack, model 050978, unit serial number 82.10923.192, occurred. At 1,000 hours, a thruster malfunction propelled Spartan 051 off mission and into interplanetary space. Immediate rescue attempts commenced with the assistance of the UNSC Prowler Circumference, joined on 1/13/2535, 11:05 hours, by the UNSC frigate Tannenberg. 322 minutes after projected oxygen in Spartan 051's Variant V Mjolnir suit expired, operation terminated as nearby Covenant action, see attached references, prompted an immediate call to action of all nearby UNSC forces. Cause of thruster malfunction remains unknown, pending further investigation, but it's hypothesized that a partially decommissioned Shaw Fujikawa Translight engine core on the platform and in close proximity to Spartan 051 at the time of the accident may have caused a series of catastrophic electrical malfunctions. Anomalous electrical activity also obscured further later rescue efforts in the region. Platform 966A has been tagged with a HAZNAV satellite, pending HMAT team dispatch. Fleetcom order D88934. Spartan 051 status, missing in action. Chapter 5. 1950 hours, December 14th, 2531, military calendar. Aboard UNSC Point of No Return, location classified. Kurt woke up in bed, an osmotic IV in his arm, and nearby monitors displaying his vital signs, blood composition, and brain oxygen saturation levels. He surmised he was in a hospital, although there was no call button and no obvious door. There was also a camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Kurt felt the familiar subsonic thrum around him, and he relaxed. He was on a spaceship. Although he preferred boot on dirt, anywhere was better than hard vacuum. He lowered the bed's railing and swung his legs over the edge. Pain lanced up his side. Cracked ribs. He'd had them many times. Bruises covered his pale skin. They were especially livid on his shoulders, stomach, and waist. He checked in the mirror for injuries, and then ran his hand over the long black stubble on his head and face. He was intact, but how long had he been unconscious? The wall slid apart, and a balding man entered. Curiously, he wore an army uniform, pinned with the eagle insignia of a colonel. His dark eyes fixed upon Kurt. "Sir!" Kurt started to stand and salute. "At ease, soldier," the colonel said. Kurt checked his motion. He opened his mouth to correct the colonel's error, but fell silent. Naval NCOs were never called soldiers. But in Kurt's experience, officers, army or otherwise, never appreciated correction, unless lives were at stake. The colonel's continued stare made Kurt uneasy. In fact, several things contributed to his unease. He was on a UNSC ship, receiving medical care. But how had he gotten here? And why was an army colonel interested in him? "I'm James Ackerson," the colonel said. He then did a curious thing. He held out his hand to shake. This was a rare occurrence. Usually, no one wanted to touch a Spartan, let alone shake their hand. Kurt took Ackerson's hand and gingerly squeezed it. Ackerson. Kurt knew that name. There had been conversations between Dr. Halsey and Chief Mendes. Ackerson had come up a dozen times, and from their inflection and body language, Kurt had surmised he was not their friend. Kurt was aware that everyone in the UNSC had the same basic goal: protecting humanity from all threats. Not everyone, however, agreed on how that mandate should be executed, which led to internal conflict. Kurt understood this the way he understood basic precepts of a Shah Fujikawa translite engine. He grasped the underlying theoretical principles, but the nuances and the actual application of that knowledge remained a mystery to him. Most likely this colonel was on permanent loan to Ani as a liaison officer. They often recruited civilians, officers from other branches of the military, or anyone they needed to get their job done. An Army colonel was approximately the same rank as a Navy captain, so while Kurt was wary, he had to be polite and even take orders from Ackerson as long as they didn't conflict with previous orders. "If you're well enough, get dressed." Colonel Ackerson nodded to the night table on which was a neatly folded uniform. Kurt stood, removed the osmotic IV patch, and dressed. "Spartan 051, what's your name?" Ackerson asked. "Kurt, sir." "Yes, but Kurt what? What's your family name?" Kurt knew he had had another name before his training. That, however, was part of a life that seemed more dream than real now. And that other name was just a shadow in his mind, as was the family that had gone along with it. Still, he struggled to remember. "It doesn't matter," Ackerson said. "For the time being, if asked, use the last name." He considered for a moment. "Ambrose." "Yes, sir." Kurt buttoned his shirt. The uniform was missing the Spartan patch of an eagle holding a lightning bolt and arrows. It instead had the clasping hand patch of the UNSC Logistical Corps. It bore the single pip of a private first class and 2 combat ribbons for Harvest and Operation Trebuchet. "Follow me." Ackerson moved out the open doors into a narrow corridor. He led Kurt through 3 intersections. Many naval officers passed them, but none saluted. They kept to themselves for the most part, eyes down. And while a few nodded to Kurt, no one so much as even glanced at Ackerson. Kurt's unease at this odd situation grew palpable. They halted at a pressure door guarded by 2 Marines who saluted. Kurt crisply returned their salute. Ackerson gave them a casual half-salute gesture. The colonel set his hand on a biometric reader, and face, retina, and palm were simultaneously scanned. With a hiss, the door opened. Kurt and Ackerson stepped into a dimly lit 20-meter-wide room filled wall-to-wall with monitors. Spectroscopic signatures, star charts, and slipstream space pulses strobed across the screens. There were several officers and 2 holographic AIs consulting with them in whispered tones. One AI was a gray-robed figure without a body, a wraith. The other was a collection of disembodied eyes, mouths, and gesturing hands, what Kurt vaguely recalled from one of Deja's art lessons as an example of Cubist art. Ackerson whisked him across the room and to another door. A second biometric scan, and they entered an elevator. There was downward motion, then a moment of zero-G freefall, and the sensation of gravity then returned. The doors opened to a catwalk that extended over inky darkness to a blank wall. The colonel approached the blank wall. A seam appeared, and then the 2 sections pulled apart. "This room is called Odin's Eye by the junior staff," Ackerson said. "You've been temporarily granted a code word top-secret clearance to enter. Whatever is said inside is similarly classified, and you will reveal none of our conversation unless the proper code words are provided. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Kurt replied. Kurt's instinct, however, was to not enter this room. He, in fact, wanted to be any place but in that room, but he couldn't refuse. They entered. The doors closed behind them. Kurt didn't see the seam. The room had white concave walls, and Kurt's eyes had a hard time focusing. "Your classification code word is Falcon 40, Ackerson said. "Now, speak freely in here." "I certainly will." He gestured to a black circular table in the center of the room, and they both sat. "Sir, where am I? Why am I here?" His words seemed to evaporate as he spoke them, deadened by the too still air in this strange room. "Of course," Ackerson murmured. "Your recovery is not complete. I've been warned of that." He sighed. "We've gone to considerable trouble to extricate you from normal nav-spec web operations, from your recon mission to Station Delphi." Kurt remembered the explosion on his T-Pack. He blinked and saw for a split second the dizzying blur of stars in his faceplate. "My team," Kurt said. "Are they?" "Fine," Ackerson replied. "No injuries." Kurt inhaled, feeling his cracked rib. Not quite no injuries. Something changed in the colonel's expression. The dark stare and hardness softened almost an imperceptible fraction. In a lowered voice, Ackerson said, "Section 3 has issued you new orders." He pushed a reader across the table to Kurt. Kurt thumbed the biometric, and the screen warmed. There were code word classified warnings, and then he saw his transfer orders under Colonel Ackerson. The usual fields for assignment location, routing protocols, and record verification were redacted. "You are now a part of a subsection of Beta 5 Division," Ackerson said. "A top-secret cell within Section 3. All the events at Station Delphi were staged to bring you here in the utmost secrecy for a new mission." Staging the events at Delphi? Arranged by a subcell of Section 3? Something seemed wrong in a way Kurt couldn't quite put his finger on. But part of it made sense now. The partially decommissioned Shaw Fujikawa Drive at Delphi Station was the perfect lure and the ideal excuse for a malfunctioning T-Pack. The sensor echo the circumference had picked up on the in-system jump was another prowler. The ship that had picked up Kurt's exhausted body after he'd been propelled on a not-so-random explosive trajectory. Though he resented the manner in which they obtained him, he had to admire the sheer elegance of the extraction plan. "You've been classified as missing in action," Ackerson said. "Presumed dead." Something cold contracted in Kurt's stomach. He checked his emotions, though, sensing that in this instance, they might not have been able to help him. "What is this new mission, sir?" Ackerson stared at him a moment, then seemed to look through Kurt, past him. "I want you to train the next generation of Spartans." Kurt blinked, taking in what Ackerson had just said, not quite understanding. "Sir, I was under the impression that Chief Petty Officer Mendez had been reassigned years ago to carry out that mission." The effort to train additional Spartan 2s was postponed indefinitely by Dr. Catherine Halsey, Ackerson said. There were other candidates within the gene pool, but they were out of sync with her age restriction protocols. And with the continuing war, her program funds were diverted. Kurt had always presumed other Spartans were being trained, that he and his fellows were the first in what would be a long line of Spartans. He'd never considered they might be the first and the last of their kind. Ackerson said, "Mendez will of course join you. It would be an honor to serve under Chief Mendez," Kurt replied. One of Ackerson's brows quirked up. "Indeed." He motioned at Kurt's secure tablet. "Read. New training protocols have been outlined, as well as an improved augmentation regime. We've learned much from the unfortunate medical processes Dr. Halsey had at her disposal." Kurt balled his hands into fists, remembering the pain of the bone grafts, like glass breaking inside his marrow, and the fire that had burned along every nerve as they'd been re-engineered for enhanced speed. As he read, he started to grasp the opportunities and challenges of this new program. The new bio-augmentations were a quantum leap ahead of those he'd received. There were lower projected washout rates. There was, however, only a fraction of the original Spartan program training time and budget. Mjolnir armor was to be replaced with something called semi-powered infiltration, spy armor systems. "With these new candidates," Kurt said, "you're trying to do more with less." Ackerson nodded. "They'll be sent on missions with higher strategic values, but correspondingly, lower survival probabilities. That's where you come in, Kurt. We need your training as a Spartan, and all your field experience passed along to these candidates. You need to make these Spartans better and train them faster. This program may be the key to our survival in this war." Kurt scanned the reader again. The new genetic selection protocol expanded the pool of candidates, but there were disturbing references to behavior problems in these less-than-ideal potential Spartans. But this mission was vital to the war. Kurt sensed that. And there would be CPO Mendez. It would be good to be working under his old teacher again. Could the two of them really train a new generation of Spartans? "In 10 years, Ackerson said, "with your guidance and a little luck, there'll be 100 new Spartans in the war. Employing several of these new Spartans to help train the next classes, there will be thousands within 20 years. With projected improvements in technology, perhaps 100,000 new Spartans will be created in 30 years. 100,000 Spartans fighting for humanity? The image swam in Kurt's mind. Was that possible? While Kurt didn't understand all the ramifications, he now understood the importance of the end result. His initial feeling of unease, however, remained. How many of these new Spartans were going to die? He steeled himself. He'd do everything he could to see they had the best training, the best equipment, be the best soldiers humanity had ever produced. Even then, though, would it be enough? He took a deep breath. "Where do we begin, sir?" Ackerson said, "New training facilities are being constructed. You will oversee the operation and simultaneously begin the screening of candidates. I have an ample supply of willing recruits for you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a tiny box, pushed it across the table to Kurt. "One last thing." Kurt opened the box. Inside were the single silver bar insignia of a lieutenant junior grade. "Those are yours now." A faint crease of a smile appeared on Ackerson's face. "I am not going to have my right-hand man taking orders from NCO drill instructors. You're going to be in charge of the entire show." Section 2, Spartan 3, Chapter 6. 1950 hours, May 27th, 2532, military calendar. Zeta Dorada system, Planet Onyx, Camp Currahee. Kurt watched the incoming Pelicans. The blocky jet-powered craft were so distant, they were only specks against the setting sun. He hit the magnification on his faceplate and saw lines of fire tracing the re-entry vectors. They would touch down in 3 minutes. In the last 6 months, he'd developed a training regime tougher than the original Spartan program. He'd created obstacle courses, firing ranges, classrooms, mess halls, and dormitories from what had been jungle and scrub plain. He'd received every piece of equipment he'd requested from NAVSPEC Web Section 3. Guns, ammunition, dropships, tanks. Even samples of Covenant technology and weaponry had appeared as if by sleight of hand. All personnel were accounted for. 6 dozen hand-picked drill instructors, physical therapists, doctors, nurses, psychologists, and the all-important cooks. All here, except the most critical person who was now on the incoming transports. Senior Chief Petty Officer Franklin Mendez. Mendez had a dozen years ago trained Kurt and every other Spartan. He would be invaluable in preparing the new breed of Spartan 3. But he wasn't going to be the solution to all Kurt's problems. After poring over every detail of the new recruits' files, Kurt discovered they didn't match the perfect psychological and genetic markers set in Dr. Halsey's original selection protocols. Colonel Ackerson had warned him they had to draw from a less statistically robust group. These recruits wouldn't be anything like himself, John, Kelly, or any of the original Spartan 2 candidates. And this would only add to a long list of challenges. With a final target class 4 times larger than the Spartan 2s, a severely truncated training schedule, the need for these Spartans in the war increasing every month, Kurt, in fact, expected a disaster. The Pelican jet transport swooped down on final approach and angled their thrusters. The sod on the parade field rippled like velvet. One by one, they gingerly touched down. Although Kurt's Mjolnir armor was not designed to bear rank insignia, he nonetheless felt the weight of his new lieutenant's bars. They pressed down on him as if they were a ton each, as if the weight of the entire war and future of humanity rested squarely upon his shoulders.
This way.
Sir? A voice whispered into his comm. The voice belonged to the artificial intelligence, Eternal Spring. It was officially assigned to the planetary survey team stationed in the northern section of this peninsula. Kurt wasn't sure why Colonel Ackerson had insisted that Camp Karahi be built next to the facility. He was sure, however, there had been a reason. Go ahead, Spring. Updated details on the candidates available, it said. Thanks. Thank me after your so-called test, sir. Eternal Spring terminated transmission with a hiss of static that sounded like angry bees. Cajoled by Section 3 brass, Eternal Spring had agreed to devote 9% of its runtime to the Spartan 3 project. The AI was of the smart variety, which meant there were no limits on its knowledge capacity or creativity. Despite its occasional theatrics, Kurt was happy for its help. Kurt blinked and accessed the candidate's data on his heads-up display. Each name had a serial number and linked to background files. There were 497 of them, a collection of 4-, 5-, and 6-year-old children that he somehow had to forge into a fighting force unparalleled in the history of warfare. The hatch on the nearest Pelican opened with a hiss, and a tall man strode out. Mendez had aged well. His trim body looked chiseled from ironwood, but the hair was now silver, and there were deep creases around his eyes, and a set of ragged scars that ran brow to chin. Chief. Kurt resisted the urge to snap to attention as Mendez saluted. As odd as it felt, Kurt was now his commanding officer. Kurt returned his salute. Senior Chief Petty Officer Mendez reporting for duty, sir. After the Spartan 2 program, Chief Mendez had, at his request, been reassigned to active duty. He'd fought the Covenant on 5 worlds and been awarded 2 Purple Hearts. You were briefed on the flight? Completely, Mendez said. As he looked Kurt over in his Mjolnir armor, emotions played over his face. Awe, approval, and resolve. We'll get these new recruits trained, sir. This was precisely the response Kurt had hoped for. Mendes was a legend among the Spartans. He had tricked, trapped, and tortured them as children. They all hated and then learned to admire the man. He had taught them how to fight and how to win. Do they let Spartans drink now? Mendes asked. Chief? A bad joke, sir. We might both need one before this day is over. He said, the new trainees are, well, sir, a little wild. I don't know if either of us is ready for this. Mendes turned to the Pelicans, inhaled and yelled, Recruits, fall out! Kids streamed off dropship ramps. Hundreds tromped onto the field, screaming and throwing clumps of sod at one another. After being cooped up for hours, they went wild. A few, however, milled near the ships, dark circles under their eyes, and they huddled tighter. Adult handlers herded them onto the grass. You've read Lord of the Flies, sir? Mendes muttered. I have, Kurt replied. But your analogy will not hold. These children will have guidance. They will have discipline. And they have one thing no ordinary children have. Not even the Spartan II candidates. Motivation. Kurt linked to the camp's PA. He cleared his throat and the sound rumbled over the field like thunder. Nearly 500 crazed children stopped in their tracks, fell silent, and turned amazed at the giant in the shining emerald armor. Attention, recruits, Kurt said and stood akimbo. I am Lieutenant Ambrose. You have all endured great hardships to be here. I know each of you has lost your loved ones on Jericho 7, Harvest, and Biko. The Covenant has made orphans of you all. Every kid stared at him, some with tears now gleaming in their eyes, others with pure burning hatred. I am going to give you a chance to learn how to fight, a chance to become the best soldiers the UNSC has ever produced, a chance to destroy the Covenant. I am giving you a chance to be like me, a Spartan. The kids crowded before him, close, but none actually dared to touch the shimmering pale green armor. We cannot accept everyone, though, Kurt continued. There are 500 of you. We have 300 training slots. So tonight, Senior Chief Petty Officer Mendes, he nodded to the chief, has devised a way to separate those who truly want this opportunity from those who do not. Kurt handed him a tablet reader. Chief? To his credit, Mendes registered shock for only a split second. He scanned the tablet, frowned, but nodded. Yes, sir, he whispered. Mendes yelled at the children. You want to be Spartans? Then get back on those ships. They stood shocked, staring at him. No? I guess we found a few washouts. You. He pointed to one child at random. You. And you. The chosen kids looked at each other, at the ground, and then shook their heads. No, Mendes said. Then get on those Pelicans. They did so, and so did the others. A slow shuffling procession. Drill instructors, Mendes said. 3 dozen NCOs snapped to attention. You will find Falcon Wing aerial descent units on the field. Load them ASAP, and make sure your trainees are properly fitted. Their safe deployment is now your responsibility. The DIs nodded and ran toward the bundled Falcon Wing backpacks. The chief turned back to Kurt. You're going to make them drop? He raised both eyebrows in surprise. At night? The Falcons are the safest drop units, Kurt replied. With respect, sir, some of them are only 4 years old. Motivation, Chief. If they can do this, they'll be ready for what we have to put them through. Kurt watched the Pelicans fire their jets and scorch the grass. But just in case, he added, deploy all dropships to recover the candidates. There may be accidents. Mendes exhaled deeply. Yes, sir. He started for the nearest Pelican. Chief, Kurt said, I'm sorry that order had to come from you. I understand, sir, Mendes replied. You're their CO. You have to inspire and command their respect. I'm their drill instructor. I get to be their worst nightmare. He gave Kurt a crooked smile and climbed aboard. Shane clung to the plastic loops on the side of the Pelican's hull. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the other kids, packed so close that he wouldn't have fallen if he let go. The roar of the Pelican's jets was deafening, but still, he could hear his own heart racing in his chest. This was the end of a journey that had started years ago. He'd heard jets like this when it started. The jets of the light freighter as it rocketed away from Harvest. It had been crowded on that ship too, filled with refugees trying to get as far away as fast as they could from the monsters. Only 1 in 6 ships had made it. Sometimes Shane wished he hadn't lived and seen the monsters burn his family and home. When the Navy man had come to visit him in the orphanage and asked if Shane wanted to get even with them, he immediately volunteered. No matter what it took, he was going to kill all the Covenant. They'd given him lots of tests, the written kind, blood tests, and then a month-long space trip as the Navy man collected more and more volunteers. Shane had thought the testing was over when they finally got into the Pelicans and came to this new place, but he'd barely touched the ground when they'd been shoved back inside and sent back up into the air. He'd gotten a glimpse of the one in charge. He wore armor like Shane had seen in fairy tale books. The Green Knight who fought dragons. That's what Shane wanted. He was going to wear armor like that one day and kill all the monsters. Check your straps! An old Navy man barked at him and the other kids. Shane tugged at the black backpack that they'd put on him 3 minutes ago. It weighed almost as much as him, and the straps had been pulled so tight they cut into his ribs. Report any looseness, the man shouted over the roar of the engines. None of the 20 other kids said anything. Recruits, stand by, the man barked. He listened into his headphones, and then a green light blinked on a panel near his head. The man punched numbers into a keypad. The back of the Pelican hissed open, the ramp lowered, and a tornado screamed around Shane. He yelled. So did the other kids. They all pushed and shoved to the front of the Pelican's bay. The old Navy man stood by the open bay door, unafraid that only a meter to his rear was open sky. He regarded the squirming kids with disgust. Behind him, a dusky orange band marked the edge of the world. Twilight and lengthening shadows slipped over snow-capped mountains. You will form a line and jump, the man shouted. You will count to 10 and pull this. He reached up to his left shoulder, grasped the bright red handle there, and made a pretend pull motion. Some confusion will be normal. The kids stared at him. No one moved. If you cannot do this, the man said, you cannot be a Spartan. It's your choice. Shane looked at the other kids. They looked at him. A girl with pigtails and missing her front teeth stepped forward. I'll go first, sir, she yelled. Good girl, he said. Go right to the edge. Hang on to the guideline. She took the tiniest baby steps to the edge of the Pelican, then froze. She took 3 deep breaths, and then with a squeak, she jumped. The wind caught her. She vanished into the dark. Next, the old Navy man said. All the kids, Shane included, slowly formed a line. He couldn't believe they were doing this. It was nuts. The next boy got to the edge, looked down, and screamed. He fell backward and scrambled away. No, he said. No way! Next, the man called, and didn't give the kid cowering on the deck another glance. The next boy jumped without even looking, and the next. Then it was Shane's turn. He couldn't move his legs. Hurry up, loser, the boy behind him said and gave him a shove. Shane stumbled forward, halting only a half step from the edge. He turned and stopped himself from shoving this kid back. The kid was a head taller than Shane, and his black hair fell into his eyes, making it seem like he was missing his forehead. Shane wasn't afraid of this creep. He turned back to face the night rushing past him. This was what he was afraid of. Shane's legs filled with freezing concrete. The rushing wind was so loud he couldn't hear anything else anymore, not even his hammering heart. He couldn't move. He was stuck on the edge. There was no way he could jump. But now he was so scared he couldn't even turn around and chicken out either. If he sat down, though, and then slowly inched back, "Go, dumbass!" the creep kid behind him pushed. Hard. Shane fell off the ramp and into the night. He tumbled and screamed until he couldn't breathe. Shane saw flashes of the dimming sunset, black ground, the white caps of the mountains and stars. He threw up. Some confusion will be normal. The red handle. He had to grab it. He reached up, but there was nothing there. He clawed at his shoulder until two fingers found purchase. He tugged. There was a ripping sound and something unraveled from his pack. Shane jerked straight, his legs whipping after him, and his teeth snapped together from the sudden bone-jarring deceleration. The spinning world stopped. Gasping and blinking away his tears, Shane saw the last bit of amber light fade from the edge of the world, and the stars gently rock back and forth around him. Overhead, the wind whistled and rippled through a black canopy. Ropes connected Shane to this wing, and his hands instinctively grabbed them. As he pulled, the wing turned and angled in that direction. The sudden motion made him dizzy again, so he let go.
Yes, sir, Master Chief.
Shane squinted and made out shapes swimming around him, black on black, like the bats on harvest. Those had to be the other kids, gliding like he was. His face heated as he remembered how he'd chickened out at the last minute in the Pelican. In front of everyone. Even that little girl had jumped. Shane never wanted to be scared like that again. Maybe if he imagined that he was already dead, then there would be nothing to be afraid of. It'd be like he died with his parents on harvest. He mustered his mental image. Dead, and nothing to fear. And to test it, he looked down. Past his dangling feet, there was a 2-centimeter green square. After a moment, he realized it was the field where all the pelicans had landed. Tiny lines snaked from the field, illuminated by tiny firefly pinpoints. Nothing to be scared of, he whispered, trying to convince himself. He forced himself to pull the ropes, angled downward, and speed toward the green field. Wind whipped through the black silk wing and tore at Shane's face. He didn't care. He wanted down fast. Maybe if he was the first one down, he'd show everyone that he wasn't scared. Shane saw tiny people and scorch marks where the pelicans had burned the grass. And no other parachutes yet. Good. He'd be first. And he'd land right in front of the green knight. Shane hit the ground. His knees pistoned into his chest and knocked the wind out of him. The black wing caught a breeze, jerked him back on his feet, and dragged him across the grass and dirt. He gasped for air, but he wasn't scared. He was angry that he'd looked so stupid having to wrestle with this parachute. The falcon wing hit the fence and stuck there, fluttering. Shane got up and unclipped himself from the harness. Something hot trickled down his legs. There was no way he'd been so scared he pissed his pants. With dread, he looked. It was blood. The skin on the back of his legs was raw. He took a tentative step, and fire crawled up both thighs. He laughed. Blood or piss, what did it matter? He'd made it. Hey, dumbass. What's so funny? Shane turned and saw the kid who'd pushed him. He lay on the grass, half tangled in his harness. Shane marched over to him, ignoring the pain in his legs. The kid got to one knee and held out his hand to shake. I'm Rob. Shane hit him square in the nose. Blood gushed from the kid's face, and he reeled over. He was going to pay for shoving him. He was the only one who knew that Shane had frozen on the edge and chickened out. He'd have to pay for that, too. Shane started pounding him with right and left fists. The kid held up his arms to fend off the blows, but Shane landed a few good ones, skinning his knuckles. Robert headbutted Shane, and he fell off. Robert stood, shook off his harness, then growling, leapt onto Shane. They rolled on the grass, kicking and punching. Shane heard a loud snap, and he wasn't sure if it was his or Rob's bone breaking. He didn't care. He kept hitting and hitting until blood spilled into his eyes and he couldn't see anymore. Large hands grabbed Shane and pulled him off. Still swinging, Shane connected with one of the Navy men, bruising the bone over his eye. The man dropped him. "Stand down!" barked a voice with godlike authority. Shane blinked and wiped blood from his eyes. The silver-haired man who'd given the order to jump stood between him and the other kid. The Navy man he'd hit pressed one hand to his swollen eye and said, "Chief, these two were going to kill each other." "I see that," the old man said. He nodded approvingly at Shane and then turned to Robert. Robert ignored the old man and took a step toward Shane with his hands raised. "I said stand down." Robert dropped his hands and staggered back as if he'd been struck. "I think you're right, Sergeant," the older Navy man said. "They really might have killed each other." He smiled, only it wasn't a smile. It was more like he was baring his teeth. "Very good. That kind of fight left in them after their first jump? A night jump? My God. I only hope the rest of them are like this." Chapter 7. 000 Hours. July 19th, 2532. Military calendar. Narrow band point-to-point transmission. Origin unknown. Termination. Section 3. Omega Secure Antenna Array. UNSC HQ Epsilon Eridani System. Reach Military Complex. Automated reroute UNSC ship. Registered 96667 ABY. File access granted. Worm protocol firewall enabled. File erased. PLNB transmission XX087RXX. Encryption code Gamma. Public key not applicable. From codename coal miner to codename surgeon. Subject progress report. Operation hypodermic. Classification eyes only. Code word top secret. Section 3 X-ray directive. File extraction reconstitution complete. Start file. Institutional records altered as per instructions. Initial contact with base AI made. Helpful, but I don't trust it. Packages delivered. Selection process started. Operation underway and on schedule. Candidates exhibit marked aggression well out of bounds of the Smith-Kensington Index. As much work training them as it is keeping them from murdering each other. They're real Hellcats. Lieutenant claims all under control. He has a plan for everything. Unsure where he's getting this confidence, but I do believe he knows what he's doing. Are you surprised? End file. Scramble destruction process enable. Press enter to continue. Chapter 8. 0900 hours, July 30th, 2537. Military calendar. Aboard UNSC point of no return. Location classified. 5 years after Alpha Company indoctrination. Lieutenant Ambrose and SCPO Mendez had been escorted to this catwalk through a series of corridors and high-security biometric vaults into the bowels of the stealth cruiser, point of no return. The security officers had then left them standing at attention on the catwalk and sealed the vault-like door behind them. Below the metal grating of the catwalk, the shadows swallowed all sound. 3 meters to Kurtz's left was a slightly curved white wall, no door. Beyond was Odin's Eye, the high-security conference room where he'd first been told of the Spartan 3 program by Colonel Ackerson. "Think this is some Section 3 test?" Mendez finally whispered. "Or maybe someone doesn't like getting news about the lousy selection results for the Beta Company candidates." "I'm not sure," Kurt replied. "My requested upgrades for the Mark II spy armor were over budget." Mendez raised an eyebrow. "Where did you hear that?" "The new AI talks a lot." Deep winter, muttered Mendez. I wonder if AIs pick their own names, or if some officer in Section 3 does it. Kurt was about to offer his opinion when he noticed there now was a door in the curved white wall. Colonel Ackerson stood there. Gentlemen, join us. Ackerson then retreated into a brightly lit chamber. Kurt noticed that he hadn't met their eyes. That was always a bad sign. They entered, and as he crossed the threshold, Kurt felt static crawl over his skin. The concave, illuminated walls of the chamber were disorienting. Kurt focused on the center of the half-spherical room on the black conference table. Two officers sat there, gazing at holographic screens that floated in the air over its surface. Ackerson waved them closer. A woman sat with her back to them. Opposite her sat a middle-aged gentleman. The man was gray and balding. The woman appeared older than regs permitted before mandatory retirement. Her osteoporotic slump, slender frail arms, and thinning white hair indicated extreme age. Kurt froze as he spotted the 1- and 3-star rank insignia on their collars and snapped off a salute. Vice Admiral, ma'am, he said. Rear Admiral, sir. The Vice Admiral ignored Mendez and scrutinized Kurt. Sit, she said. Both of you. Kurt didn't recognize either of these high-ranking officers, and they didn't bother to introduce themselves. He did as he was ordered, as did Mendez. Even sitting, though, his back was ramrod straight, his chest out, his eyes forward. We were reviewing the record of your Spartan 3s since they were operational 9 months ago, she said. Impressive. The Rear Admiral gestured at floating holographic panes that contained after-action reports, still shots of battlefields filled with Covenant corpses, and ship damage assessment profiles. The insurrection of Memore, he said. That nasty business at New Constantinople, actions in the Bonanza asteroid belt and the far-gone colony platforms, and half a dozen other engagements. This reads like the campaign record of a cracking good battalion, not a company of 300. Damned impressive. That was only a fraction of the Spartan 3 program potential, Colonel Ackerson said. His eyes stared at some distant point. I'm sorry, sir, Kurt said. Was? The Vice Admiral stiffened. It was clear that she was not accustomed to her junior officers asking questions. But Kurt had to. These were his men and women they were talking about. He'd kept his eyes and ears open for news on Alpha Company, and had cultivated intelligence sources outside ONI, Section 3, and Beta 5. Being Commandant of Camp Currahee had its privileges, and he'd learned how to use them. He'd managed to track his Spartans during the last 7 months, until his sources had mysteriously gone silent 6 days ago. Only the AI Deep Winter had given a clue as to their whereabouts. Operation Prometheus. Tell me about the selection process for the next class of Spartan 3s, the Vice Admiral asked Kurt. Ma'am, Kurt said, we're operating under Colonel Ackerson's expanded selection criteria, but there aren't enough age-appropriate genetic matches to meet the larger second-class target number. There are sufficient genetic matches, Colonel Ackerson corrected. His face was an impassive mask. What's missing are data to find additional matches. We need to prescribe mandatory genetic screening in the outer colonies. Those untapped populations are... That's the last thing we need in the outer colonies, the Rear Admiral said. We're just getting a handle on a near civil war. You tell an OC they gotta register their kids' genes, and they'll all be reaching for their rifles. The Vice Admiral steepled her withered hands. Say it is part of a vaccine program. We take a microscopic sample as we inject the children. Inform no one. The Rear Admiral looked dubious, but offered no further comment. Go on, Lieutenant, she said. We've identified 375 candidates, Kurt said. Slightly less than we started with for Alpha Company. But we've learned from our mistakes. We'll be able to graduate a much higher percentage this time. He nodded toward Mendez to give the chief the credit he richly deserved. Mendez sat completely still, and Kurt saw he wore his poker face. Every instinct Kurt had screamed that something was wrong here. But, the Rear Admiral said, that's nowhere near the 1,000 projection for the second wave. A brief scowl played over Ackerson's lip. No, sir. The Vice Admiral set her hands flat on the table and leaned closer to Kurt. What if we loosen the new genetic selection criteria? Kurt took note of the we in her question. There was a subtle shift in the power structure at the table. With a single word, the Vice Admiral had made Kurt a part of their group. Our new bio-augmentation protocols target a very specific genetic set. Any deviation from that set would geometrically increase the failure rate, Kurt said. The thought of dozens of Spartans being tortured and ultimately crippled as they lay helpless in a medical bay filled him with revulsion. He managed to contain the feeling. The Vice Admiral raised one threadbare brow. You've done your homework, Lieutenant. However, as our augmentation technology improves, Ackerson said, one day we'll be able to expand the selection parameters, maybe to include the entire general population. But not today, Colonel, the Rear Admiral said and sighed. So we're back to about 300 Spartan 3s. That will have to do then. Kurt wanted to correct him. 300 new Spartans plus those in Alpha Company. Let's move on to the review of Alpha and Operation Prometheus, the Vice Admiral said, and her face darkened. Colonel Ackerson cleared his throat. Operation Prometheus occurred on the Covenant manufacturing site designated as K749. The holographic asteroid materialized drifting over the table, a rock with molten cracks that made a spiderweb pattern over its surface. K749 was discovered when the Prowler Razor's Edge managed to attach a telemetry probe on an enemy frigate during the Battle of New Harmony, Ackerson said. They then followed the craft through slipspace. The first and only time this technology has actually worked, I might add. And they discovered this rock, 17 light years past the UNSC outer boundary. The image magnified, revealing mid-altitude images of factories on the surface that belched smoke and cinder, and showed that the volcanic fissures were canals of flowing molten metal. A gossamer lattice surrounded the asteroid. Tiny lights winked on the filaments, and black specks drifted near. Spectral enhancement, the Rear Admiral said, showed us what they're using all that metal for. The view shifted closer. The lattice-work girders were 100-meter wide beams, and the black specks appeared to be the bones of whales in orbit over K749. A dozen partially constructed Covenant warships. Kurt had a difficult time believing what he was seeing. So many ships. How large was the Covenant fleet? And only 17 light years from the UNSC frontier? It could be nothing less than a prelude to an all-out assault. K749 is one large orbital shipyard, Ackerson explained. All the apparent volcanism is artificial, created by these. He tapped his tablet once more. 30 infrared dots appeared on the surface of the asteroid. High-output plasma reactors that liquefy metallurgical components, which are refined, shaped, and then transported via gravity beams for final assembly. The Prometheus op was a high-risk insertion onto the surface of K749. The Rear Admiral explained. 300 Spartans hit dirt at 0700 July 27th. Their mission was to disable as many of these reactors as possible. Enough so the liquid contents of the facility would solidify and permanently clog their capacity to produce alloy. Colonel Ackerson then tapped the holographic display. Star System and Team Cam recorded Alpha Company's process. A handful of the hot infrared points on the asteroid's surface flared and then cooled to black. Initial resistance was light. Ackerson tapped a button and a new window opened. On this display, Spartans and semi-powered infiltration armor systems moved, their camouflaged patterns shifting imperfectly against the molten metal and black smoke of the factory. Kurt wished his suggested upgrades for the spy armor software had been implemented before Alpha had graduated. There was a burp of suppressed submachine gun fire, and a pod of grunt SAB workers fell dead. After 2 days, the Admiral said, 7 reactors were rendered inoperative, and a counterforce was finally organized by existing Covenant units. A new video feed appeared. The vulture-like jackals moved in squads through large courtyards and filed over archways. They were more organized than their grunt counterparts, and they worked in fire teams, methodically clearing section by section. But Kurt knew his Spartans wouldn't be concerned. They would be the hunters. 30 jackals moved into a circular court, where engineers tended a churning pool of molten steel. The jackals cleared every hiding spot, and then started to cross, warily scanning the rooftops. Flagstones exploded and sent the jackals sprawling. Sniper fire took out the stunned aliens before they could get their shields in place. The Covenant counter-response was neutralized. The Rear Admiral continued. And over the next 3 days, Alpha Company destroyed 13 more reactors. The large infrared asteroid-wide view changed. 2/3 of the surface had cooled to dull red. But, the Rear Admiral said, a massive counterforce appeared in orbit and descended to the surface. Colonel Ackerson opened 3 more holographic windows. Spartan 3s engaged elites on the ground, trading fire from cover. Banshee flyers swooped down from building tops. 2 Spartans fired shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles and stopped the air assault cold. On day 7, the Admiral said, additional Covenant reinforcements arrived. The video from a helmet camera showed a dozen Spartan 3s limping and falling on a smoldering landscape of twisted metal. There was no unit cohesion. No 2-man teams covering one another. In the heat-blurred background, elites took up superior positions with good cover. By now, the Rear Admiral said, 89% of the reactors had been destroyed. Sufficient cooling had occurred to permanently shut the operation down. Alpha Company was cut off from the Calypso exfiltration craft. The window showing the Spartan 3s tilted sideways as the owner of the helmet cam fell. Ackerson rotated the holographic display 90 degrees to rectify the image. 3 Spartans remained standing, firing suppressing bursts from their MA-5Ks behind a crashed Banshee flyer. Then they broke from the cover and sprinted. A second before the flyer was destroyed by an energy mortar. IFF tags at the bottom of the screen identified these Spartans as Robert, Shane, and carried between them Jane. She had been the first candidate to jump that first night of indoctrination. Team Bio appeared in another window. Robert's and Shane's blood pressure was close to the hypertensive limit. Jane's bio signs were flatlined. Seeing them like this, it felt like someone had driven a metal spike into Kurt's chest. A pair of hulking Covenant hunters blocked the Spartans' retreat. They raised their 2-meter-long fuel rod arm cannons. Robert unloaded his assault rifle at them, which hardly made the pair flinch as it spanged off their thick armor. Shane switched to a sniper rifle and shot through one hunter's unarmed midsection, and then pumped 2 rounds into the other's vulnerable abdomen. They both went down, but still moved, only momentarily incapacitated. Elite fire teams, meanwhile, popped up on either side and unleashed a volley of needles and plasma shot. Robert caught a blot of plasma in the stomach. It stuck there, burning through his spy armor like paper. Screaming, he managed to reload and spray his MA-5B on full auto at the elite who had shot him. Team Bio showed his heart in full arrest, but he still grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and lobbed it at the enemy fire team. And then he fell. Shane paused to look at Robert and Jane, then turned back to the elite fire team and shot in 3-round controlled bursts. More elites appeared, surrounding the lone Spartan. Shane's rifle clacked. Empty. He pulled out his M6 pistol and continued to fire. An energy motor detonated like a small sun 2 meters away. Shane tumbled through the air and landed prone, unmoving. And that's all we have, Colonel Ackerson stated. Kurt continued to stare at the screen of static, his heart racing, half expecting the feed to go live again and show Shane gather up Robert and Jane, and together they'd limp off the battlefield, wounded but alive. 7 years Kurt had trained them and grown to respect them. Now they were dead. Their sacrifice had saved countless human lives, and yet Kurt still felt like he'd lost everything. He wanted to look away from the screen, but couldn't. This was his fault. He had failed them. His training hadn't prepared them. He should have rectified the flaws in their Mark I PR suits and fixed them faster. Mendez reached over and tapped the colonel's tablet. The display mercifully blanked and faded away. Ackerson shot the chief a glare, but Mendez ignored him. "Recent drone recon shows the entire complex cold," the rear admiral said. "No more ships will be built at K749. Just to clarify," Kurt whispered, and then he paused to clear his throat. "There were no survivors of Operation Prometheus." "It is regrettable," the vice admiral said, with the slightest softness now in her voice. "But we would do it again if presented with a similar opportunity, Lieutenant. Such a facility within 2 weeks' journey of the UNSC outer colonies. Your Spartans prevented the building of a Covenant armada that would have resulted in nothing less than the massacre of billions. Their heroes. Ashes. That's all Kurt felt." He glanced at Mendez. There was no emotion on his face. The man held his pain well. "I understand, ma'am," Kurt said. "Good," she said. All trace of pity had now evaporated from her tone. "I put you in for a promotion. Your Spartans performed well above the program's projected parameters. You ought to be commended." Kurt felt the only thing he deserved was a court-martial, but he said nothing. "Now, I want you to focus and accelerate the training of the Beta Company Spartans," she said. "We have a war to win." Chapter 9. 1620 hours, August 24th, 2541. Military calendar. Zeta Dorada system. Near Camp Currahee. Planet Onyx. 4 years after Spartan 3 Alpha Company Operation Prometheus. Bullets peppered the dirt near Tom's head. He pushed farther back into the hole, hugging the ground, trying to be as flat as possible. The irony was Team Foxtrot had done everything by the book. Maybe that was the lesson today. Going by the book doesn't always work. Tom had led them through the forest, evading snipers and patrols of drill instructors waiting to jump them. They made it too easy. That should have been his first clue. The DIs never made things easy for them. When they'd come to the open field, he'd checked the perimeter. No one had been there. He'd waited, though, and checked and rechecked. DIs, in their Mark II semi-powered infiltration armor, were hard to spot, even with the thermal imagers in his field binoculars. Tom had then warily led his team onto the field and toward the pole with a bell. That was the mission. Ring the bell. They had had 2 hours to find and ring the thing to qualify for continued Spartan training. There were 418 candidates and only 300 slots. Not all of them could be Spartans. His mistake had been leading his entire team into the clear. They'd all been too eager. It got them ambushed. Machine gun fire from the treetops rained down on them. Adam and Min in flanking positions were immediately taken out. Only Tom and Lucy had made it to the muddy hole. It was just deep enough to keep from getting shot. "This is crazy," Lucy spat through her mud-covered face. "We gotta do something." "They have to run out of ammo sooner or later," Tom told her. "Or one of the other teams will show up and get us out of this jam." "Sure they will," Lucy said. "After they ring the bell." She squinted at the trees. There has to be a way out of this. Automated gun turrets up there. That's why they didn't show up on the thermals. That's what the lieutenant was always saying about machines. They easily fool the unsuspecting, but they're also easy to break. The guns wouldn't kill them, but they'd sure as heck stop them cold. With only gray sweatsuits and light boots for protection, the stun rounds hit so hard they numbed whatever they hit. Legs or arms, or God help you if you got nailed in the head or groin or an eye. Nuts to this. Lucy rose into a crouching stance. Tom grabbed her ankle, pulled her down, and punched her in the gut. Lucy doubled, but she recovered fast, rolled over Tom, and got him in a stranglehold. Tom shrugged out of the lock and held up both hands. "Come on," he said. "Truce. There has to be a way out of this. A way with us not getting shot." Lucy glared at him, but then said, "What do you have in mind?" "What is the point of this exercise, Lieutenant?" Deep Winter asked. The AI holographic projection of an old man took a step toward the bank of monitors and touched the screen, showing a boy and a girl pinned by machine gun fire. A crackle of ice spread over the plastic. Chief Mendez stood and swatted at a mosquito, frowning as he glanced back and forth among the 24 displays in Camp Currah's control center. The air conditioner had broken, and both Mendez's and Kurtz's uniforms were soaked with sweat. Kurtz said, "Our candidates are doing well in their studies?" Deep Winter turned his glacier blue gaze to the lieutenant. "You have seen my reports. You know they are. Since you announced their grades were a factor in the selection process, they practically kill themselves every night to learn everything before they pass out. Frankly, I don't see." "I suggest," Kurt said, "you not worry about seeing the point of my battlefield drills and focus on keeping the candidates on track with their studies. What could an AI possibly know about what it was like on a real mission? Bullets zinging so close over your head that you didn't so much as hear them, but felt them pass. Or what it was like to get hit, but still have to keep going, bleeding, because if you didn't, everyone on your team would die." Alpha Company had lost their team cohesion on Operation Prometheus. Kurt vowed that would not happen with Beta Company. Deep Winter ruffled his cape, and a flurry of illusionary snow swirled about the control room. The AI was likely programmed with human safety protocols, so it was natural for it to be concerned. "We don't know what they're capable of," Kurt finally told Deep Winter. "Stick with the by-the-book drills, and we'll never find out either. But put them in an impossible situation, and maybe they'll surprise us." "Short definition of a Spartan," Mendez remarked. That's what people had said about the Spartan IIs, who were the genetic cream of the crop and wore Mjolnir armor. They could do the impossible, and do it alone. The Spartan IIIs, though, would have to work together to survive. Be more family than fire team. "Still," Deep Winter whispered, "this is cruel. They will break." "I'd rather break them," Kurt said, "than let them go out into the field without ever experiencing an intractable tactical situation. Personally, I don't think these kids can be broken." Mendez said more to himself than to Kurt or Deep Winter, his gaze now firmly fixed on Tom and Lucy. 10 years old, and these two have so much grit, they scare the bejesus out of even me. "Look," Deep Winter said, "what are those two doing now?" Kurt smiled. "I think the impossible." "Let's go over the plan one more time," Tom said. Lucy huddled next to him in the mud hole. "Why, you think I'm stupid?" Tom didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Those turrets are probably using radar to target, so we fool them." "And if they're using thermals?" Lucy asked. Tom shrugged. "Then I hope they nail you first." Lucy grimly nodded and hefted a muddy rock. "So we throw these into their cone of fire," Tom said. "The small angle will make them hard to track. Maybe tie up their brains for a fraction of a second more. Then we run. Evasive maneuvers. Try not to step on Adam and Min." "Got it," Lucy said. Tom grasped his rock tighter and pumped it once, working up his courage. He and Lucy knocked their fists together. They stood at the same time, hucked both rocks. Tom heard gunfire, but didn't pause to look. He ran right, then left. He rolled and tumbled, and then sprinted like crazy for the tree line. He felt the dirt near him exploding with tiny puffs. Fire cut into his thigh, and his leg lost all feeling. He pushed off with his good foot and landed hard on his stomach in the tall grass by the acacia trees. Staccato bullets dotted in the ground centimeters from his prone body, but missed him. He laughed. He was just inside their minimum angle of fire, Stupid machines. He rolled over and spotted Lucy, panting and crouched in the grass. Tom waved to her, and then pointed up into the treetops. Lucy gave a thumbs-up signal. Tom hopped on one leg. Some of the feeling was coming back, mostly the feeling of pain. He stomped it out. He couldn't let it slow him down. The drill instructors might show up at any second. He pulled himself up into the lower branches of one of the acacias that shook with gunfire. He used great care to avoid the spines in the tree's trunk. He climbed up 10 meters. On a platform sat an old M202 XP machine gun, hooked up to an automated fire control. It twitched back and forth, waiting for a target to present itself. Tom reached up and disconnected the wires from the radar array, and then the power supply. The gun froze. He climbed onto the platform and unscrewed the securing bolts. He pushed the gun off the platform. It made a satisfying thud as it impacted the muddy ground. Tom climbed down. He grabbed the machine gun, cleared the barrel, and stripped off the remaining auto-fire control. He test-fired a burst of 3 rounds into a tree trunk. "Awesome," he said. Lucy was down from his tree as well, machine gun balanced on her shoulder. She moved onto the field to help Adam and Min get up. "Come on," she said. "We still got a bell to ring." Adam boosted Tom and then Lucy to make a human ladder, and then Min clambered up and clanged the bell. Nothing had ever sounded so good. They all climbed down. "Now for some payback," Tom said. "Adam, Min, take up spotting positions," he pointed. "In those trees there and there." They nodded and ran off to the trees. "You and me and these," Tom told Lucy, patting his machine gun. "We'll set up there." He pointed to a large boulder. "I'll be there." He nodded to the tall grass on the edge of the field. "And do what?" she asked. "Well, we've cleared the field and rung the bell. I figure with the other teams getting here and ringing the bell in record times." Lucy smiled. "The DIs will come running and gunning." The DIs at Camp Currahee were a mix of hand-picked NCOs, medics, and the washouts from the 1st Spartan class. The washouts always went out of their way to make the lives of the Beta Spartan trainees hell. 2 years ago, Team X-Ray vanished on a routine exercise up north. A lot of the kids said there were ghosts up there, floating eyes in the jungle. But everyone really knew the DIs had done something and covered it up. ONI even came in and fenced the place off, called it Zone 67, and declared it was absolutely off-limits. It was time to teach those DIs they couldn't get away with bullying Beta Company. Men whistled from the treetops. Teams Romeo and Echo slinked into view. Tom signaled them and explained the plan. Teams Zulu and Lima joined them, and soon 24 trainees were scattered in the trees and grass, watching and waiting. It only took 15 minutes before a whistle sounded at 3 o'clock. There was a subtle motion in the grass on the edges of the field. Tom signaled his scouts to fall back, while Lucy maneuvered to get a better line. Tom ran in a crouch to intercept. He spotted 3 targets, their spy armor mimicking the grass well, but not well enough to cover the parted grass at their feet. They turned to face Lucy. Tom fired, spraying at knee level where the armor was weakest. 3 human-shaped outlines crushed the grass, screaming and convulsing as the rubber bullets pelted them. Lucy joined him and opened fire. When the screaming stopped, Tom moved in and peeled off their armor, revealing 3 very dazed DIs. They hadn't identified themselves, so by the rules of engagement, they were fair targets. Adam ran up and helped him and Lucy strip the bodies. "Pistols and MA5Ks, both with stun ammunition," Adam said. Lucy held up a double handful of grenades and smiled. "Flashbangs." "Now," Tom said, grinning, "this really gets interesting." The moon had come out and set. The grass was wet with dew, and Tom's stomach growled so loud he thought it might give away his position in the dark. 5 waves of DIs had come and been neutralized by a now armed, armored, and fully equipped Spartan trainee defense team. The instructors were tied up in the middle of the field by the bell. Hostages. Tom and other Spartans were working together like they never had before. And they were winning. He was hungry, wet, and cold, but Tom wouldn't have traded places with anyone in the entire galaxy. He heard a rustle in the tall grass, turned, machine gun aimed waist high. There was nothing there, and nothing on the thermals either. He must be getting jumpy. A hand clamped on his shoulder, while another hand wrenched the machine gun from his grasp. Chief Mendez stood over him. At his side was Lieutenant Ambrose. Tom half expected Mendez to shoot him right there. "I think that's quite enough," Mendez growled. The lieutenant knelt beside Tom and whispered, "Good work, son." Chapter 10. 0420 hours, February 19th, 2551, military calendar. Aboard UNSC Hopeful, interstellar space, Sector K009. 5 years after Spartan 3 Beta Company Operation Torpedo at Pegasi Delta. Kurt walked the empty corridors of the UNSC Hopeful and entered the atrium. Blazing lights overhead mimicked a realistic sun. Air recirculators made the leaves of the small grove of white oaks rustle. He smelled lavender, a scent he hadn't experienced since he was a child. The most extravagant feature of the Hopeful, however, was the 10-meter curving window in the atrium, something utterly unheard of on any other ship in the UNSC fleet. But then, the Hopeful was unlike any other ship in the fleet. Naval officers described her as the ugliest thing to ever float in zero-G. The ship had been built before there had been major rebel activity in the colonies. A private medical corporation had purchased 2 scrap repair stations, each a square-kilometer plate of scaffolding, cranes, and cargo trams. These 2 plates had been connected to make an off-centered sandwich, and within, a state-of-the-art hospital and research facility had been constructed. In 2495, the UNSC had commandeered the vessel, added engines, minimal defensive systems, 6 fusion reactors, and the Shaw Fujikawa translite system, and transformed the Hopeful into the largest mobile battlefield hospital in history. While most naval officers agreed she was unsightly, every enlisted Marine Kurt had ever spoken with declared her the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen. The Hopeful had taken on mythical proportions with the men and women who had to fight and die in the front lines. She had been damaged, but had survived 18 major naval battles with rebel forces and 4 encounters with the Covenant. The ship's staff and technology had a reputation of saving lives, in many cases, literally bringing the dead back to life. Today the ship had been parked in interstellar space, essentially the middle of nowhere, by order of Vice Admiral Parangoski. And while the thousands of critically ill patients could not be evacuated, the 8 decks surrounding Docking Cluster Bravo had been cleared of all personnel, while ONI moved in their equipment and staff. The Spartan 3 program had to remain under a cloak of absolute secrecy. Kurt wished the Hopeful lived up to her reputation, because today, the lives of his Spartan potentials were at stake. His candidates had had to endure so much in the last year. To accelerate the program's timetable, puberty had been artificially induced. Human growth hormone, as well as cartilage, muscle, and bone supplements, had been introduced into their diet. And the children had metamorphosed into near-adult stature within 9 months. They'd become clumsy in their new, larger bodies, and had struggled to relearn how to run, shoot, jump, and fight. And today, they'd face their most dangerous test. They would either become irreparably disfigured, die, or be transformed into Spartans. No, that wasn't right. While these kids didn't have the heightened speed or strength of a Spartan, they already had the commitment, drive, and spirit. They already were Spartans. Kurt heard boots clicking down the corridor, then muffled steps crossing the atrium lawn. "Lieutenant, sir?" A young man and woman approached with the long loping gaits of people who'd spent much time in microgravity. They wore standard naval uniforms, bearing the stripes of a petty officer's second class. Both had close-cropped black hair and dark eyes. Kurt had had to pull a few strings to keep the Beta Company survivors of Pegasi Delta with him. Colonel Ackerson had wanted Tom for his own private operations, and ever-silent Lucy had narrowly avoided an unfit-for-duty classification and permanent reassignment to ONI Psych Branch for evaluation. He'd had to appeal to Vice Admiral Parangoski, claiming he needed Spartans to train Spartans. Over Ackerson's objections, she'd agreed. The result? Tom and Lucy had become Kurt's right and left hands over these last years, and Gamma Company were the finest Spartans ever. Tom and Lucy spent so much of their time in their spy armor, it took Kurt a moment to recognize his attachés. Their armor, along with the rest of Gamma Company's semi-powered infiltration suits, was being refitted with new photoreactive coatings to boost their camouflaging properties. There were other experimental refits: gel ballistic layers, upgraded software suites, and other functions that would hopefully be working within a year's time. Tom and Lucy snapped off simultaneous salutes. Kurt returned the salute. "Report. The candidates are ready to board, sir," Tom said. Kurt got up, and the three of them walked back down the corridor and into docking cluster Bravo. It was the size of a small canyon, with the capacity to cycle a fleet of dropships simultaneously through its massive airlock system. There was ample space for triage and trams that could whisk an entire company of wounded soldiers to emergency surgical faculties. Airlocks screamed, and there was a sudden gust of fresh air. Dozens of bay doors parted, and Pelicans rolled into the bay on steam-powered beds. The Pelicans' rear ramps lowered, and the Spartan candidates filed out in orderly rows. Kurt had briefed them about the procedures. They'd be sedated and injected with chemical cocktails and surgically altered to give them the strength of 3 normal soldiers, decrease their neural reaction time, and enhance their durability. It was the final step in their transformation to Spartans. It was graduation day. He'd briefed them on the risks, too. He'd shown them the archived videos of the results of the bio-augmentation phase of the Spartan 2 program. How more than half of those candidates had washed out, either dying from the procedure or becoming so badly deformed they couldn't stand. This would not happen to the Spartan 3s with the new medical protocols. But Kurt had wanted one final test. Not one of the 330 candidates had opted out of the program. Kurt had to petition Colonel Ackerson for 30 extra slots for this final phase. He simply didn't have it in him to randomly cut 30, when every last one of them was willing and ready to fight. Ackerson had gladly granted his request. Kurt stood and saluted as the line of candidates passed him. They marched by, returning his salute, heads held high and chests out. On average only 12 years old, they looked closer to 15, with the sculpted musculature of Olympic athletes. Many had hard-won scars, and all had an ineffable, confident air about them. They were warriors. Kurt had never felt so proud. The last candidate lingered, and then halted before him. It was Ash, serial number GO99, leader of Team Saber. He was one of the fiercest, smartest, and best leaders in the class. His wave